Well, I'm so pleased to be here and to talk to you because here you are, enthusiasts on butterflies and moths just like I am, and interested in the same sort of things that I am. And in particular this morning, I want to talk to you about the distribution of butterflies and moths and why they are. And we all like that, don't we? We look at Mark Cubitt and Roy Leverton's amazing book on moths in Scotland and look at it and think, why don't I get that species? Why is it found here and not there? And then maybe you find something new. Wow, I've got something new. What's happened? Is it spreading? Is it climate change? Is it this? Is it that? So one of the great joys for me, just like you, is why do butterflies and moths occur where they do? I find that a really fascinating subject. And I want to talk to you about one aspect of that here today, just to explore some ideas with you about this particular and very peculiar situation. And that is that there are quite a number of butterflies and moths which occur in southern Britain and up particularly in the Northwest Highlands. Why is that? What on earth is happening? How on earth has that changed? So, you probably know that I like burnet moths. And so I'm going to start with the burnet moth, but later on other people are talking about burnets, so this is just me using this one. The New Forest burnet, and its name is giving you a clue as to why I'm interested in it. The New Forest burnet is just about our rarest moth. The population this year at its single site in Britain was probably about 50 or 60 or 70 individuals, if we're lucky. David will tell you more, but that's about it. This is a real priority and a real excitement, but I just like burnet moths, and I hope you do as well. Now, the interesting thing about this species is this, that originally it was found in the New Forest, where it lived in glades, and when it became extinct in 1927, possibly because of over-collecting. And it's the classic example of perhaps the only species in Britain where over-collecting has been an issue. I gather people used to stake out square areas in these glades with bamboos and stand there with their net. And if I'm not that, well, anyway, enough of that. How horrible. But that's apparently what happened. In 1963, a forester who was interested in moths was visiting the northwest coast of Scotland up here, and he found our colony of the New Forest burnet moth. So 1963, and it's been there ever since. And BC has been struggling to conserve it and actually doing a very good job, I think. So why on earth does it occur here and here? What on earth is going on? This is the site. You can see it's very steep. It's very sunny, as far as Western Scotland ever is. It's very warm. The midges are hellish. The rocks on the slope are awful. And I'm too old and decrepit to get there anymore because it's in a very remote site. Why is it that it was found in those places? Tricky. What about this? And it's a shame Tom isn't here, because Tom named this gorgeous little moth the Tiree twist, and it occurs on the island of Tiree, and it occurs here on the island of Tiree. This is Balfetric Rocks. And back in 1984, I was with my family and my entomological mentor and his family, and we stopped Balfetric Rocks to have our picnic, and we sat down on these rocks, and he said to me, "My God, that's new to Britain." I said, "What do you mean new to Britain?" Well, he said, newish. It used to occur on the south coast near Dover, but it's extinct. And now it occurs on Tiree. We found it. So there it was. And here's the map. And here's where it used to be, actually here, not there. And here is Tiree. Well, it's nearly Tiree, but it's the vice county. You see what I mean? So here is a species which is the classic example of this disjunct distribution. Some of you will know Tiree, and one of the nice things about it is that it's the sunniest place in Britain. It's probably the windiest place in Britain as well, because it's like a blooming aircraft carrier when you're on Tiree, but it's the sunniest place in Britain. And on Tiree, it's found on specially rich rocks, which probably means the vegetation is satisfactory as well. But that doesn't alter the question, why does it occur there and it occurs there, or it used to occur there? Let's have a slightly different example. Narrow-bordered five-spot burnet that many of you will know. And this has a very strange distribution. And as far as we're concerned, Talisker Bay, which is here, and the moth occurs on these slopes here. This is on the island of Skye. Okay, now, its other distribution isn't very far south because it's here. And you can see, look, that with these dots here, and I'll give you more detail in a moment, it occurs here, but it's spreading up the east coast and into the central belt. And there's the Skye population. And if we look at that in a little more detail, and it's a bit confusing, but the main point I want to make is it's been spreading up here into Fife and across into the central belt. How strange. But here's an interesting question. If climate change continues, and that continues to spread, will it reach the population on Skye? And what will happen then? Well, I can tell you one thing, because I have crossbred examples from actually just somewhere down here with the Skye ones, and they produce hybrids which are fully fertile. So same species, what will happen? Now, climate's the obvious thought, isn't it, about why this might happen. And so I'm going to very quickly go through changes in climate since the last ice age so that we can get to grips with what's been happening. So let's see where we get to. So the ice age really began to give up about 13,000 years ago. There was a little bit of a wobble to start with, and at least by 10,000 years ago, the climate was warming quite rapidly. And by 9,500 years before present, the climate is broadly similar to the climate that we have been experiencing in the last 50 years or so. And woodland had invaded Britain. Presumably, lots of moths invaded Britain at the same time. However, there was then a period of climatic optimum that was up to 3 degrees warmer than present. I'm not sure how oceanic or continental it was, but certainly much warmer. And so I wonder, if we look down here, where were the moths? When did they arrive and spread? Well, perhaps they arrived in this period, they spread in this period, and perhaps they were much more widespread in that period than they are now, because the climate was more suitable and man had less influence. Okay, the climate stayed the same for a while. And then until about 450 years ago, there was a gradual cooling. And at that time, we entered what people call the Little Ice Age. Now, in London at that time, there were ice fairs. There was probably permanent snow in the cairngorms. The climate was much colder. Where were our moths? Could it be that they had shrunk back towards the south and some had become stranded while others retreated south? Could it be? Then it warmed up again, and now, of course, it's getting warmer and more stormy. And we could ask, where will our moths go? Okay, well, I'm going to park that question for a little while. But it could be, couldn't it, that moths had spread into Britain, had become very widespread, and then in the colder conditions had retreated, leaving some relict populations stuck up in the north. So maybe the distributions were once universal. But deteriorating climate led to a retreat southwards and disjunct remnants in the north. I don't know whether you find that convincing. However, there are some more thoughts about this. And here's another micro. I do like micros. This is Aethes rutilana. It's probably got an English name, but I've forgotten what it is. It's a beautiful moth, a beautiful, beautiful moth. And in 1983, or do I mean, yeah, 1983, this was found halfway up Burnet. Sounds a bit odd, but it has since been found in, oh, I've gone backwards instead of forwards. It's since been found in other hills further north. Forget about that. That's probably an error. This is where it used to occur, and it was last recorded in the 1960s. So that looks classic, except there's a big difference in the habitat. In southern Britain, down here, this occurred principally on the North Downs, where juniper used to be quite common, and the juniper bushes are this high, and it's a typical southern grassland with juniper bushes all over them. So here we go, juniper, looking as it should do. But up in the north, Aethes rutilana feeds on prostrate juniper halfway up hills like Burnet or Argyll or Foinaven. How can you make sense of that? Because if this was left as a disjunct population in the northwest, it ought to be in the warmest places to mimic the South Downs. Instead of that, it's halfway up a hill. That's very strange. Here's something else that's strange, the checkered skipper. And you will know as well as I do that the checkered skipper was found, roughly speaking, during the Second World War, with some previous records that have come to light, in the area around Fort William, and it lives in places like this. Beautiful, warm hillside, this is Glass Drum, I think, and we're familiar with the way in which our checkered skippers are doing things. And incidentally, they are spreading, I believe. I suppose you could say, were they spread and we hadn't found them? But I think they are spreading a bit. Well, that's nice. But as you will know, in southern Britain, where it used to occur in woodlands in the East Midlands, it's become, first of all, extinct in the 1970s. And now there's a reintroduction. So if we look at the map, here are ours. This is where they used to occur. And there's a reintroduction site down here, which is apparently doing very well. I don't know much about that, so some of you who know more about that reintroduction can tell me more about it later. But I think it's probably doing okay. Right. So why is that interesting in my argument? What is it that's going on? Well, if you were going to introduce butterflies here of the checkered skipper, the first thing you might think of doing is going up here and having a look at the butterfly and asking yourself, what does it do? What's its ecology? What does it like? What plants does it feed on? All these sorts of things. And as well as that, you might begin to think, I wonder what sort of gene pool it has in these different places. Now, I showed you that picture earlier on of Glass Drum. How different is that compared with woodland rides in southern woodlands, if you know about those? Very different indeed. So first of all, the ecology was very different in the two places. Okay, well, that's not too bad an issue, because when species get to the edge of their range, they often become specialized and live in slightly different conditions to the rest. The British swallowtail is on the Broads. On the continent, it's everywhere. So maybe ours are just a bit more specialized. But when they looked at the genetics of the situation, they discovered that by taking old specimens in museums from this area, taking off their legs and looking at the genotypes of those, they discovered that the genetics of these populations weren't similar to those, but they were similar to the populations in Belgium and the near continent. So it looks as if there's a big genetic difference between the top and the bottom. My original argument isn't lost quite yet because they were isolated by several thousand years. Perhaps that's why they've changed. Not very convincing, because why do the ones in England, why haven't they changed from the ones from Belgium? Tricky. So let's find another example. The Kentish Glory. Beautiful moth. Many of you are familiar with it. You saw a picture early on. It's one of our Scottish priorities. And what happened to the Kentish Glory, if I could find my notes, which up here lives in these circumstances, in very extensive birch regeneration areas. That's David Barber. I don't know if some of you remember him. He was a stalwart of butterfly conservation and came to this meeting many times, alas, now dead. David is looking at a bush. He wouldn't put his finger up to point to it, but there's an egg batch just here, which he's looking at. So this is what the Kentish Glory likes. And the standard explanation of what went wrong down south was that the woodlands down south were too small, too constrained, too managed to have extensive areas of birch regeneration. And incidentally, that patch is now dense birchwood, and the moth has moved on, but it's moved on locally to other young birch. This is in the middle of Deeside that's available there. So let's look at the distribution. There we are, look, rock tunnel, recently refound, Deeside, Speyside, Culbin. This is the distribution with us. And here's the distribution down south, originally in Kent, hence its name, all across here, up into East Anglia. And the last area where it was found in southern England in 1967 or so was in the Wyre Forest, just west of Birmingham. And they now say that they have areas in the Wyre Forest which have regenerating birch over a big enough area that they can think of reintroducing the Kentish Glory. Perhaps they're right. But they did the same. They collected specimens here, or they collected the legs from specimens here to look at their genetics. They looked at old museum specimens from here, and they looked at their genetics. And lo and behold, they discovered that the genetic makeup of the moths that used to occur in this area are more similar to the continent and not similar to Scotland. So this is very interesting, isn't it? In the 1950s, a professor in Oxford called E.B. Ford, and if you haven't read his book on moths in the New Naturalist series, please do, because it's brilliant. He was interested in genetics at a time when you couldn't genotype things by collecting eggs and looking at actual genes. He, in a general sense, he worked on population genetics. And he suggested something different from what I suggested a few minutes ago. He suggested that where you have species like this, instead of it being one population which has become disjunct, it was probably two separate invasions of Britain. And at whatever time it happened, this lot came from the continent, and that's why they're here. And at whatever time it happened, this lot probably came from, don't know where, perhaps Scandinavia, perhaps the Low Countries. In other words, perhaps across in this direction. So he had the inkling in the 1950s and 60s that the explanation was not one widespread population which split, but 2 invasions of Britain. Right, so do you favour a widespread population fragmented by cooler conditions, or 2 separate invasions from Scandinavia, perhaps, or more southern European countries, or maybe a combination of both? Now, I have no idea. If I was still working, rather than being incredibly ancient and retired, I would probably be collecting genetic material from various different parts of the continent to compare against the genetics of the Kentish glory, say, from Deeside, where I know it so well, and seeing whether I could make some sense in genetic terms of these differences. It could be, do you remember back to the Tiree twist, which is left in a very warm, sunny place on base-rich rocks, very similar to its distribution down south? Maybe that one was originally widespread, and then one population got left on Tiree for 10,000 years, or however long it is. Whereas the Kentish glory here, oh, sorry, of course I've moved on from the map, but you remember it? Maybe the Kentish glory is more of a candidate for 2 separate invasions. Isn't that interesting? I don't lie awake at night worrying about it. I often sit in my chair in the afternoon and think about it. And I hope you'll think about it as well. And if you have any comments to make, any suggestions to make, any questions to ask, I would be very delighted to try and answer them for you. Those of you interested in Microlepidoptera might recognize this book, which is the field guide that I produced with Steve Palmer and John Langmaid, who is alas now dead. Now, this was 2018. It's in desperate need of an upgrade. So Steve Palmer and I recruited the fantastic help from Mark Cubitt, who is sitting down here, who knows about computers and how to work them. And we have updated this field guide. And if you're interested in micros, that's a good thing to have. And coming very soon is a free version of the text, a PDF. This is where Mark really comes in, a searchable version in Excel, which allows you to enter things that you have found, like a caterpillar in October on a particular food plant, and it then gives you a list of candidate species that you might be working with, and also a free app. Now, I'm ancient, I'm a fossil. On my phone here, which is an Android phone, I have this app, and I use it every day, and it's fantastic. So how are you going to get these? Well, they're going to be on the website of the British Entomological and Natural History Society, probably mid-November. It's the best we can think of. And just to give you an idea, please may I ask what's going on? No idea at all. Don't touch the pad. I thought I was touching those. Okay, it's my fault. My fault. Okay, so just to give you an idea, look, here's the app. And you can see that you can enter the stage you found, the month you found it in. If you click that, you can put in a food plant. There's a help guide as well, and then your search comes up. And here is a search, mine in October on apple, and here are the species that occur on it. So this is now on the point of release. If you want to find out about the app, I have one. Mark Cubitt has one. Would you like to stand up, Mark, so that the rest can see him? Right? And you can come and talk to us about it. And otherwise, it will appear on the website of the British Entomological and Natural History Society. And if you don't like books, you no longer have to carry one of these around with you. Thank you very much.
Anthony asked me to come and talk to you today about my holiday. Hope that's okay. So we're doing a bit of show and tell about how I went to Mexico and got to tick something off my bucket list. I will caveat this as well that I am not a photographer, so please don't be too harsh on my photography. And as I said, I am not a butterfly specialist, so if I get anything wrong, please be kind to me and just come tell me at the end. So, anyone not familiar with the monarch butterfly? Great, I'm done. Excellent. So maybe just for those online, in case they're unfamiliar with the monarch, it is a beautiful large butterfly, predominantly found in North America, where it breeds and it feeds as a caterpillar on milkweeds. It has 5 instars, and similar to our cinnabar moth caterpillars that we all love and adore, this caterpillar sequesters the toxins from the milkweed plant to make itself toxic to predators. Pretty good tactic, very successful. So what do we know about the monarchs? We know they are infamous for their incredible migration. So they travel thousands of miles from where they breed and live during the spring and summer in North America, and they travel to 2 different locations. So the majority of the North American monarchs are going from as far north as Canada, through the USA, and down to the forests of Mexico. There is, of course, another population that does something slightly different, and they go over to the West Coast and they spend the winter on the shores of California. Now, I'm not going to talk about those today because I haven't been there yet. Maybe that will be another talk. We'll see. But we're going to focus on that western population, the eastern population, sorry. So I'm sure, as you all probably know, the monarch makes this incredible journey of about 2,000 to 3,000 miles. And it's going southwards to central Mexico, and the return journey is a relay race. It's not one individual. It's actually going to be the great-great-grandchildren of the monarch that makes the individual journey down to Mexico, that makes the return journey up north again. Now, monarchs are really incredible. Their ability to know when and how to make this incredible journey is quite remarkable. They have 2 internal clocks that they use to do this. So they have a seasonal clock that allows them to know when the right time of year is to make that migration. And they also have their antenna that help them assess the time of day. And then they also have an internal compass that helps them steer into the right direction too. So my very first monarch, here it is. That's back in 2016. I went to go to visit New York, and I was in Brooklyn at the Botanic Gardens there, and I saw my first one. I thought, oh, I've got to get a picture of this. As we all do, we chase them around for a very long time until we get that shot. So this was my very first picture of a monarch butterfly, and I was thrilled. I'd read about this butterfly, I'd seen it in documentaries, and I thought, oh, fantastic, I've ticked that off now, I've seen it. But then I came back and I told my boss at the museum, I've seen my first monarch butterfly. And he told me all about his trip to Mexico and how he got to stand in the forest surrounded by millions of monarch butterflies. And then I felt really jealous, and I thought, wow, I wish I get to do that one day. That would be amazing. So at that point, it was on my bucket list. Now, as we know, in Scotland, they are a very occasional visitor. If you look at the NBN Atlas, there are about 700 records of monarch butterflies for the UK. You can see predominantly those records have been in the south, and just a few locations in Scotland. Now, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the last observation in Scotland was this one in 2021 up in Shetland. Anyone know of any others? No? Okay, great. So that was very exciting when that one came in a few years ago. And obviously, they're not meant to be here. They're blown off course. There's not really any hope for them to breed or to make a return journey. This is the end if they make it here. So at the museum, we did get an opportunity to tell the story of monarch butterflies. They weren't currently featured in any of our displays, and our director saw this very dull, dark corner of one of the galleries and said, I want to put a case in there, that's a bit boring. Can we ask Ashleigh if she's got any ideas? I had ideas. I said, can I do a case on beetles? He was like, well, pitch me 3 ideas and I'll choose my favourite. He didn't pick the beetles. So we ended up with this proposal for a monarch butterfly display. And I had seen something similar in an American museum. And my idea was to try to give a sort of flavour for this story, just with a very small number of butterflies to replicate their roosting behaviour, how they gather on the oyamel fir trees in the forests of Mexico, and they kind of huddle together and cuddle up. So I wanted to do that with just 2 branches. That didn't work out. I ended up having to use a tree trunk because the designer thought that it would be simpler. Never work with designers. And also then to really get the message across of those sheer numbers, the huge volume of butterflies, we were going to put a graphic behind to make you sort of feel like you're in the forest and give it a bit more of a diorama feel. We also wanted to include a map to tell that story, the journey of migration. And in an ideal world, I would also like to have included the life cycle. I got knocked back there, that wasn't allowed. So simplified version, we ended up with the fake tree and many butterflies attached to it. So I stood inside this case for 3 days. They did let me go home in the evening, but it's there sticking on the butterflies. I did over 100, I think it was 120 in the end. I'll also stress and emphasise that these were obviously not wild collected monarch butterflies. We were able to source some butterflies that had been used in research and then reuse those for educational purposes, which was brilliant. We also wouldn't be using any of the specimens from the collection because those are our scientific specimens. And as you can see, this mock-up in the centre, I had to test things out by using paper butterflies to get the positioning right. It was all a bit of a faff, but we got there in the end. And if any of you have seen the display, I hope that you think it's all right. There we go, that's the final case. And one thing that we've included on the information panel, the label at the bottom, is actually a tagged monarch butterfly. So you might know that the reason that we know so much about their overwintering sites now is because there are organisations that have been tagging monarchs. So they've been tagging them in the US and in Canada, and then they have been being captured in Mexico, and those codes being submitted through the citizen science portals. So that's how we know that they're going to specific sites. So this is the moment you've all been waiting for. I got to go to Mexico this year and it was incredible. We were there going for a family occasion and we were in Mexico City, and it would only have been a day trip to go and see the butterflies. So it was a no-brainer. I was going to go. So we chose to go to the reserve, that's the Sierra Chinchua Reserve in Michoacan. There are at least 4 reserves that you can go to as a member of the public. The others are not open for public access. The most famous one is the El Rosario Reserve, and that is because it has the largest populations of monarch butterflies there. Sierra Chinchua has a slightly smaller population, but from all the reviews we read, we thought this would have a bit more of a natural feel, less of a like tarmac path and big garish archways and butterfly flags. This was a bit more, you go on an hour's hike through the forest and then you see the butterflies. So that's what we did. And we had a couple of incredible guides. This is us walking through the forest and of course getting distracted by everything else on the way. I would say that organised tours are maybe not the best for me because I wasn't allowed to stop for very long, but never mind. Anyway, walking through the forest, we finally get to sort of the hour point and the guides are pointing things out in the trees. And at first I actually couldn't see what they were pointing at in the distance. And then I saw them. So you can just about make out the clusters in the background there of this funny selfie. And as amazing as it was, there was this tiny feeling in me that I wasn't disappointed, but maybe it was a little bit of an anticlimax. The clusters, there maybe wasn't as many as I was anticipating, but then we got closer and the binoculars came out and we could start to have a proper look at these clusters. And my goodness, just the density of butterflies was really something else. A really special moment and something I'm never going to forget. That morning was particularly dull and cloudy. I should have given a bit more context in that this area, this reserve, is in the very mountainous part of Mexico. So the elevation is about 3,500 meters above sea level. And this is about a 3-hour drive from Mexico City. So it was quite chilly. And we were there for about 15 minutes, taking photographs, looking at these lovely roosts. And then the sun came out and everything changed. So apologies for the shaky footage, but the clusters all began to move. The wings started fluttering, there was movement, and a few butterflies started taking to the sky. And then a squirrel came along and it landed on one of the branches and the place just erupted. There was this explosion of butterflies. So yeah, you can see a little bit more sunshine here. And the butterflies, when it's warm enough, I should have said this was February. The best time to see them is the end of February. When it's warm enough, the butterflies are able to come down and nectar from the flowers below on the forest floor, of which there was quite a lot. In fact, that was something I was really surprised about this forest. It had a lot of flowers in it. So here is another clip for you. Unfortunately, we haven't got sound, but if you can use your imagination for a second, it sounded like rain. There was maybe a group of 15 of us, and we were all very, very quiet, whispering when we needed to. So it was silent apart from a bit of bird song and the noise of the butterfly wings. So you'll have to pretend you can hear that. So the most amazing thing was kind of looking up towards the sky through the canopy and just being able to see thousands and thousands of butterflies. And you can see that big cluster moving there as well. So a really special moment. I got tears in my eyes at one point, felt really emotional. I'm so glad I was there with my husband and he managed to capture this moment as well. Most flattering picture of me I think he's ever caught. But it was really, really wonderful, and I would thoroughly recommend if any of you ever get the opportunity to go there, go see them whilst they're still there. And I say that because obviously the populations are not doing well. I'm going to just check my notes for the figures here. So the way that they're monitoring the populations in the overwintering sites is actually by the acreage that's occupied by the butterflies. Counting them individually would obviously be impossible. So in the late 90s, the area occupied was about 45 acres in central Mexico, and that was estimated to be 384 million butterflies. This year, 4.42 acres. So that's 38 million butterflies. Big decline, big loss. We know all the reasons why: pesticide use, the lack of the food plant across its migratory path, habitat loss in general, illegal logging in the overwintering sites. So all of this is contributing to this phenomenal loss of an incredible species. But fortunately, there are some wonderful charities, American-based charities like the Xerxes Society, who are doing phenomenal work to improve habitat availability, and milkweed is being planted a lot more throughout the US, and people generally embracing wilder spaces as well, as we're doing here. So there is hope for them. And another clip for you there as well. So very special. But moving on, we're quite lucky in that we've got our own couple of migratory species that we get on our shores, things like the red admiral and, of course, the painted lady. So this image is taken from the collection centre in Granton, where I'm predominantly based, as is this other one here. It's been an okay year for painted ladies, but it's not been a big one, has it? Just to get a little plug in here, those of you who have seen me talk at this meeting before about this project will know we've been doing a lot at our collection centre to enhance the space that we've got and make it better for our insects and other wildlife. A little plug, we were also on Gardeners World a couple of weeks ago, so if you want an update to see what the site's looking like now, go catch that on iPlayer. But I was thinking about the painted ladies a lot this week, and we do have a couple of drawers worth of specimens in the collection. And I just wanted to use that as an opportunity to say to you that, you know, don't forget about the collections. It's a resource that's there to be used by all of you. It's for all of you. And there are definitely going to be historic records that are in there that are not included in the databases that are available online at the moment. So whatever group you're working on, and you want to tap into that historic data, we are here for you. You're going to be hearing a lot more in the coming years about digitisation projects that we're doing at the museum. Unfortunately, we're not going to be targeting butterflies, but we will be including some moths in our work. So watch this space. Maybe we'll come back and tell you about that. And then I just wanted to wrap up by telling you about what we have been doing this week. And this time last year, I was approached by an artist called Ed Harrison. This is him on the left, looking at some of our death's heads. And Ed is an illustrator and conservation campaigner. So he is very, very passionate about getting people to connect with nature. And his recent project is called Wild Wings of Hope. and it's looking at the story of migration using swallows, swifts, and the insects that they rely on to get people to connect, and get people to connect through the story of migration from Scotland all the way to Africa. So this includes our painted ladies, it includes our death's head, it includes lots of different insects, but the birds are at the moment getting the big limelight, I think. He is working with two amazing storytellers. This is Chief Giftamu, and he's also working with Cara Silversmith, a Scottish storyteller. And they are putting together these wonderful events for the general public, especially a big success with children. And this week, we had the papercraft activities, we had the storytelling. I was there with a display of migratory insects. And I just want to say a very big thank you to several folks in the room today, because we also had a team from BC Scotland come to champion the butterflies and moths as well. So thank you to Dorothy, to Juliet, to Richard, to Jeff, to Harris, and to Lindsley. It was brilliant to see you all in action and engaging so many of our visitors this week. So thank you very much, and I can't wait till the next time we get to work together. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon. Yes, it's a pleasure to be here as always. And yeah, my first thing to say is thank you very much to everyone who sent me information to put into this talk today. There was a huge amount submitted. I have struggled to fit it all in. Patrick calculated that I would have needed 0.6 of a second to talk about every single thing. So clearly I've not done that. And my apologies to anyone who wishes their thing should be in. I haven't made it. This was my original slide that I was putting together, and I was halfway through it and I was adding these butterflies on it, and then I thought, actually, given the last few weeks, that's probably all it needed to be. There's been a huge amount of red animals about recently, which has just been absolutely lovely. So people who've been before will obviously know that it's usually this man who is stood here giving this talk each year in the autumn. But Tom has walked off into the sunset and abandoned us. So you are stuck with me, and I will do my best. Fortunately, Tom has been kind enough to send some photos of what he's been up to since he retired. To be fair, I think he deserves his rest, to be fair to him. So, right, enough of that nonsense. We'll move on to some proper butterflies and moths. So Mark kindly mentioned the checkered skipper earlier and gave a bit of an introduction to it, which is handy for me. So this is one of our kind of priority butterflies in Scotland. And for a long time, we thought its range was pretty stable. And that's the blue dots on there. So this is kind of North Argyll, Le Cabre, Fort William areas. Tom, about 10, 12 years ago, ran a survey for checkered skipper to see if we could find out more about its range. And that's what those lime green dots are. So we filled in a bit of the range. And if I try and find the light, down here at around Tainalt, there looked to be some, it looked like the butterfly was starting to spread in that area. So we had a hint of what was to come. But in the last 5 years, there's been quite a lot of change with checkered skipper. So over here on Mull, the butterfly first appeared 2 or 3 years ago. Chris Ostick found it near Craigmuir. And then our very own Pete Moore found it up here, getting towards the Cairngorms, moving further up Glen Speen. And then in the last couple of years, it's appeared near Oban. It had never been found in that part of North Argyll before. Last year, Sheena Macaulay, one of our volunteers out Oban Way, found it to the south of Oban, which was new again. And then Richard Buckland had it slightly further south again, south of Oban. This year, Stuart Bentz and myself found it at Loch Awe, about 10 kilometres south of the previous records. There were more sightings on Mull. And most excitingly was this butterfly, which was photographed back in May. And it was here on the Slate Peninsula on Skye. We don't have any records around Arisaig or Mallaig or on Knoydart. So it's quite a jump and was quite a surprise that that butterfly was found there. And it wasn't alone. Others were seen at that site, I believe, and photographed over a couple of weeks. So quite exciting that one of our priority species seems to be spreading. It's got to be climate change, doesn't it? We don't know exactly what the mechanism is, but it seems likely that the earlier, warmer, drier springs that we've been having are benefiting this species and allowing it to spread into habitat that it previously wasn't able to occupy. Potential checkered skipper habitat is everywhere on the west coast of Scotland. So the world is its oyster if climate change allows it to move into those areas. Whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, who knows? I really liked this photo, which our trainee Mhairi Hume took this summer. So this was a checkered skipper on a window ledge on the main roundabout in Oban, right in the middle of the town centre, completely out of its usual habitat. And this isn't a species that really travels a long way, generally speaking. You don't see it in places you wouldn't expect to. So perhaps just an indication that this is a butterfly on the move. So one of the highlights of 2025 has been that a lot of our butterfly species came out early, and a lot of them had second broods that don't usually have a second brood or a partial second brood. So one was the lovely small blue here, which was the first record was on the 30th of April, up on the Mhairi Firth. It's about 10 days to 2 weeks earlier than the butterflies usually seen up on the Mhairi Firth. So that was quite significant. And then it was seen as a second brood in all of these places. So there was 6 seen at Glamis Castle in Angus in August. There was 3 at Fort George near Inverness in September, 4 at Dornoch in late July. They would have been second brood. The Ballingers had 2 on the East of Ross coast in August. There was single seen on the Eyemouth coast, and it was also seen as at Bin Forest and Huntly, where new populations appeared in the last few years. Pretty much all of the Scottish populations had a partial second brood this year, which is probably the biggest we've ever observed. Dingy Skipper also started flying in late April on the Mhairi Firth, and it also had second brood records at Logie Quarry. That's very unusual. I could only find 2 other instances of Dingy Skipper records in August in Scotland. Small pearl-bordered fritillary. There's a whole cluster of second brood records. On iRecord, at least 10, but it probably had quite a widespread partial second brood in many parts of Scotland. The checkered skipper I mentioned earlier, it had a record on the 29th of April, which equals the earliest it's ever been seen in Scotland. So all of these things just going to show how early a spring and how wonderful a spring that we had. All of these species here also had really early flight periods. Pearl-bordered fritillary, poor Anthony, he arranged some pearl-bordered fritillary workshops in Perthshire towards the end of May. The butterfly wasn't even in the wing because it had gone. Incredible. Marsh fritillary was early, about the 10th, 15th of May it appeared in Argyll. Northern brown Argus was early in lots of places in the borders. It was early on the Solway coast. Excitingly, Elspeth and others discovered new colonies of Northern brown Argus in North Fife that have probably been there for a long time. That's kind of a new area for Northern brown Argus. Dark green fritillary also had quite an early year this year. Just right across the board, early dates. Now, we heard about painted ladies, but another migratory species that we get in Scotland is the clouded yellow. Did anyone see a clouded yellow this year? Oh, wow, quite a few. Well, Paul Kirkland tells me that down in Dumfries and Galloway, where he is the butterfly recorder, there were 38 records of clouded yellow this year. The previous high count for any year this century is 5. So it's clearly been a significant year for clouded yellow. They do have like years, like painted lady have years. And in Scotland, I think we could say that this was a clouded yellow year. There are also records in Arran, around Glasgow, up into Fife and the Lothians, and up as far north as Dundee. Holly Blue is a bit of a different tale this year. So people have stood here before me at these gatherings and told us of the wonderful spread of Holly Blue over the last few years. This is all the records of Holly Blue in the last few years on iRecord. And you can see how widespread it's become around Edinburgh, right up the east coast as far as Aberdeenshire, and it's also consolidated around Glasgow and the Ayrshire coast as well. It's been one of the success stories of the last few years. Simon, the butterfly recorder for the Lothians, tells me that in the last few years he has averaged 1,000 records for holly blue in the Lothians. This year he only had 100. There's been clearly a population crash in much of Scotland for holly blue. However, I don't think it's anything to panic about. In England, where holly blue is quite widespread, it goes through big population changes, and it's due to a relationship with a parasitic wasp. It seems quite likely that the parasitic wasp has caught up with the butterflies' movement into Scotland, and we're perhaps now entering that cycle. So it'll be interesting to see in future years if the butterfly responds. I've heard from recorders that up here in Aberdeenshire, where it's at the edge of its range, it's probably avoiding that parasitoid wasp for now. And numbers have been quite good. Our very own Patrick Cook had one in Bankery, which was Newfork in Cardenshire, I believe. But the one that's photographed here, I think, is a highlight of holly blue for the year. So this was seen by Katrina Walker, who is a moth recorder here on the Isle of Gia, right on the west coast of Scotland. Now, I live here in Argyll, and I've seen holly blue once in my garden. There's been a couple of records on the Isle of Bute, but there's hardly been, well, there has been no others on that side of the Clyde. So to get over to Gia is quite significant. And I wonder if this might actually be an Irish butterfly. Because if you look on the map there, the distance from Ireland to Gia is pretty much the same as it would be from Inverclyde. And the prevailing winds might be kind of taking it that way anyway. So it'll be really interesting in future years to see if holly blue starts to spread further, because it hasn't conquered the west coast yet. Purple hair streak's another butterfly we've heard a lot about in recent years. So new populations have been found. They've probably been there a long time, but we just didn't know they were there in the borders and D-side, but also here up in Speyside. So it was found at Loch Petulish up here, but it's also been found south of Aviemore. And this year, Holly Doherty found it at the Highland Wildlife Park. Now, for anyone who knows Tom Prescott well, will know that he lives just here. How many years has Tom been missing purple hair streaks on his toast? I can say these things now that he's not here. So what about butterflies? Well, it's been something of a mixed bag, I would say. I think the whites had a really good summer. There was periods in July and August where whenever I looked in my garden, there was whites flying about. It didn't even matter what the weather was, they were there. Green-veined whites, large whites, small whites, they all seem to do quite well. But for peacock and small tortoiseshell, I'm not sure it was such a good year. Very few people have reported them in their highlights to me. I maybe saw more small tortoiseshells this year than I have done in the last 2 or 3 years, but they were drowned out by the red admirals for sure. And peacock, I think that might be the worst ever year I've seen for peacock in Scotland. I've barely seen any. And I didn't see any caterpillars on nettles either in the summer. So a little bit worrying for those two species. I just love this photo, which was from Brodick Castle on Arran, and it's reported there was 40 red admirals circling around an oak tree where there was a sap run. Just wonderful. Who knows what this butterfly is? Gatekeeper, yes. Now, last year there was 7 records of gatekeeper north of the Solway Firth, so in Dumfries and Galloway. This year there was only 2. So this is quite a widespread species in Cumbria, and we've been expecting it to move into Scotland. And we thought that maybe last year was the signs that it was becoming a breeding butterfly. But it seems to have a bit of a setback this year. There was only 2 records, one of which was this, which was seen near Annan and reported on iNaturalist. It can be overlooked for meadow browns. So if you're in the south of Scotland, particularly Dumfries and Galloway, be aware. Your meadow browns might not be meadow browns, and keep an eye out for gatekeepers if you're not so familiar with them. So that's one to watch. The wonderful and beautiful comma continues to do well, particularly in the north of Scotland. Quite a few people came back to me and said that they'd seen good numbers of them or heard of good numbers. It reached the north coast last year, And this was one up in Sutherland, so it's spreading west along the north coast now and consolidating. And this was Caroline Russell's photo from her garden up in Sutherland. Moving on to the moths. So, in the last few years, lime hawk moths have appeared around Glasgow. There's good numbers of lime trees in some of the parks and gardens in Glasgow, and the moth has been found there. But last year and this year, it has spread out into Renfrewshire and Dumbartonshire, excitingly. So there's two photos of adults here supplied by Paul Tatner from his recorders in Renfrewshire, one of which, perhaps not shown here, was recorded in April, so really quite early. And Lorna Blackmore photographed this caterpillar on a lime tree. So definite evidence of breeding. This is not a species really known in Scotland apart from this population in Glasgow. So it's quite exciting that this large and beautiful moth might be spreading. So it could be coming to a garden near you soon, hopefully. Perhaps one of the stories of the year has been the wonderful Clifton nonpareil, or the blue underwing. So these 4 photos here are from Berwickshire, where it was recorded by 4 different recorders. This one was way up in Kincardineshire, where it was new for the Vice County. Tom Prescott, the jammy git, had one himself up in Glenfeshie. And this one is perhaps the most exciting one, which was seen in Arisaig, way up the west coast of Scotland. So most of these moths have been moving up the east coast and not the west. So it's quite amazing to get one way up on the west. But Mark Cubitt and Catty Baird report that they are confident that this moth is breeding in 2 woodlands in East Lothian. It's been doing really well in England in recent years, and there's been a lot of excitement about it. So it appears that it may now be breeding in Scotland, which is fantastic. So it may be on its way to a woodland near you, if you're lucky. So it's, again, one to watch because it may continue to spread with any luck. For anyone who's not familiar, this is a huge moth. This is one of our biggest moths. So if you find one, fantastic. One of the other highlights of the year, kind of often reported to me by the county moth recorders, has been there's been a lot of moths that have had a late brood, which we wouldn't normally expect in Scotland. So things like the white emerald, the swallowtail, July bell, they have all been seen in September and October. Usually these are single brooded moths which occur earlier in the season, but presumably because it was such a warm and sunny year, they've been able to have a partial second brood. And quite certainly light emerald has been reported as a second brood across quite a lot of Scotland. So it's signs of change in our moths, as ever. Migrants. So it's been another really, really good migrant year. Last year was a good year, and this year has been too. These are all, some of them are quite common migrants, some of them are a bit scarcer, but they're usually recorded in Scotland each year. So we've got the vestal up here, we've got the small mottled willow, which has had quite a few records up the east coast. And some in the west coast. It was found on Coll. There's barely any records of this migrant in the west of Scotland in the last 30, 40 years. It was also found in Ayrshire. And some of these moths have had a really good year as migrants. This is a much rarer migrant. So these have been arriving as well, or this one has anyway. So this was the Isle of Bute, toadflax pearl. It's a micro. Sorry, Mark, I'm not even going to try and pronounce that. This was a new to Scotland moth, first ever record in Scotland. And Cathy McCurdy had only been moth trapping for 2 weeks. Credit to her for, taking a photograph and finding out what it was. So incredible stuff. Right, I've got a video here. Let's see if this will play. And I'll see who can shout out the quickest what it is. Yes, very good. Who has seen a hummingbird hawk moth in Scotland this year? Wow, I hate you all. I have still never ever seen one in Scotland. Probably serves me right for living in rainy Argyll. But yeah, lots of county moth recorders have reported how many of these were seen. Particularly up the east coast, but also inland in Peeblesshire. and right up to East Sutherland, I believe, is the furthest north I've heard of. That video is Paul Mapplebecks, who was here today, so thank you for that, Paul. Another moth that we've been interested in Scotland in the last few years is the large red-belted clearwing. So this is a moth that Chris is going to tell you a bit more about later, so I won't go into too much detail. But the easiest way to find it is with a pheromone lure. So that's a fake scent that a fake version of the scent that the female produces to attract males in. And you can buy these and it attracts them in. Up on D-side, we've got quite a lot of records, but there was quite large areas of D-side where we didn't really know that the moth was. So Helen Rowe took it upon herself with some assistance from local recorders and discovered 7 new 10-kilometre squares for the moth, showing that it really is very widespread on D-side. We're beginning to realise that this moth is just really under-recorded in Scotland, and that any areas where birch has been a historic part of the landscape is very likely to contain good numbers of large red-belted clearwing. It's just that nobody ever sees them without the pheromone lure. This was an exciting find. So the small yellow underwing, it's quite a small little moth, and it was found in Scotland, and then it disappeared for about 80 years. It was rediscovered a few years ago down in the borders in Roxburghshire. Malcolm Lindsley has supplied me with this information. So David Lewis found a second site for the moth in recent years at Ancrum in Roxburghshire. Now, this was just on the edge of an arable field. It was nothing special. So that begs the question of, is this moth a little bit more widespread in the borders? Because that's not necessarily the types of habitats that recorders are always going into. And it's quite small, it's day flying, it's not going to come to your moth trap. So interestingly, that could be one to watch, one to look out for if you're in that part of the world.
David, quick one. There's been a record on a roadside in South Lanarkshire.
Ooh, thank you, Mark. Selkirkshire, so this is also Malcolm's Vice County, and last year Tom stood here and told us about this fantastic moth catches that John Wright has been having. And well, he's been at it again. So John lives up in the Yarrow Valley, which is quite exposed. That is the scene behind the background photo there. John had 17 new species recorded for the Vice County this year, and just from moth trapping in this really exposed part of the southern uplands. And he has had amazing falls of migrants. So you can read the description there: 13 scarce border straw, 2 Palpita vitrialis, 3 dark swordgrass, 26 rusty duck pearls, 20 run rush veneer, and a micro that I'm not going to pronounce. Incredible stuff. You might expect to get these migrants on the coast in reasonable numbers, but inland it's just incredible. And I'm not sure we've really got an explanation for how this might be happening. But amazing that he's doing this. Incredible. So I'm just going to finish off, because I don't want to keep you from your lunches for too long, by just doing a quick whip round of some of the better moth discoveries of the year. So lesser treble bar is quite an interesting one. So there's been quite a few records of this. So treble bar is a moth that's much more widespread in Scotland. It's quite common. Many of you who are moth trappers will see it regularly, but lesser treble bar is very similar, but quite scarce. And it's turned up at a few places in the uplands this year around Inverness. In fact, Pete Moore trapped about 20 near Ardusir, and that prompted Mike Taylor to look back through his county moth records, and he realised that the moth had actually been recorded at that site 5 years ago, but just overlooked. By looking at photos, he was able to tell that. So incredible stuff, and it might be that those of you who are seeing treble bars, you need to keep a bit more of an eye out and see if they might be lesser treble bars. The distinctions are fine, but you can work it out. This is an incredible, lovely moth, this chocolate tip, and it's one of Scotland's rarest moths. It's really only been known from the Muir of Dinnet in recent years up on D-side. Helen Rowe recorded this on the south side of the Dee this year, which represents a little bit of an expansion for this gorgeous moth. It feeds on aspen. Why it's not more widespread, we don't really know. Maiden's Blush. This was an incredible record, which I have wrongly attributed to Paul Brooks. Yeah, it's Paul Baxter, I think, who has recorded this. So sorry, Paul, I've given you credit where you shouldn't have had any. But this was up in Kincardineshire, and it was new to the Vice County. It's believed to be a migrant, but there are very, very, very few records of Maiden's Blush in Scotland ever. So incredible record. Now I had to put some pugs in, didn't I? So Thomas stood up here in past years and told us a little bit about Fletcher's or Popper's pug, which has been spreading in Scotland. It was first discovered in Argyll and in Butte, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. It's quite hard to tell apart from some other pugs, but now that people know what to look for, it's been turning up much more widely. It feeds on lime trees, so people trapping around lime trees should certainly be aware of it. But it was new this year to Stirlingshire. It was new this year to Renfrewshire, and Ken Brown also caught it in Tillicoochee for the 2nd year running. So definitely a species that is spreading, or maybe it's just been there a while. We don't know. Even moths that are long established in Scotland were finding in new areas. This is up in Wester Ross. Heath rivula is a kind of priority species for butterfly conservation, and it was new for Wester Ross this year, interestingly. Those of us in central Scotland will be getting quite familiar with these moths because these are becoming quite common with us in central Scotland, but they're still moving north. So clay triple lines made it up to the Isle of Skye this year. Buff footman, which can be seen in really high numbers now in central Scotland and feeds on lichens, it's made it all the way up to Easter Ross in East Sutherland this year, new for those Vice Counties. And Alder Moth has made it up to East Ross as well. So more evidence of spread. This lovely thing is a figure of 8 moth, which was recorded in Ayrshire. It had been reckoned to potentially be extinct in southwest Scotland, so this was quite a significant record this year. And I'm going to finish with this. Who knows what that caterpillar is? It is, yes. Now, Donny Lockhead found this whilst he was tending to his potato patch in Renfrewshire this year. Interesting because Death's head hawk moth feeds on potatoes, or it can do. This caterpillar was behaving extremely aggressively. It mugged Donny of his spare change. There is our Death's head hawk, and this was an adult seen up at the battlefield at Culloden this year by Holly. Oh, it's hidden, but that said, the last Scottish caterpillar record was 1959. So whilst these adults do come to Scotland on a more or less annual basis, and it's a big moth, it can fly here quite easily, we don't see the caterpillars. So that's the first record in about 70 years. But actually it wasn't, because 2 weeks earlier he was one in Stirlingshire. So this was Susie Rainford who found it on a path, and thanks to Martin Culshaw for the information. So incredible, and it just goes to show what summer it was that there was 2 Death's head hawk moths at least. They were just the ones that were found breeding. There was quite a number of records of adults around too. This terrifying looking thing came out of a beehive on the very north coast of Scotland. Dead, presumably killed by the bees, and completely descaled, but it was managed to be identified as a Death's head hawk. So yeah, something lovely to leave you with before your lunch. But yes, thank you very much to everybody who sent in their records. There was so much that I couldn't cover that I'm going to put it in the e-news as articles, so please do keep an eye out for that. And if you're not subscribed to e-news, then please do. But yeah, thanks very much.
So yeah, I'm going to be speaking mostly about some work I did this summer surveying the transparent burnet moth, but also a little bit about the marsh fritillary butterfly. So I think most of us will be aware, or at least somewhat aware, of the Species on the Edge project, but it's a 4-year partnership project run by Nature Scot and 7 conservation organisations collaborating at a landscape scale to conserve 37 of Scotland's most threatened coastal and island species. We have 19 of these species in the area that I work in, which is Argyll and the Inner Hebrides. So
I'm not going to go into this, but I just wanted to take a moment to say how important I think traineeships are and how important it is to start careers in conservation. I've learned so much over the past 7 or 8 months, and I'm just so grateful to have had this experience. So I even learned how to make a little butterfly in the sand like that with my fellow trainees. So there's 4 of us all together, and one of us is out in the Outer Hebrides with Bumblebee Conservation Trust, and there's 2 of us in the northeast with RSPB. But to get back to what you care about, we have 19 species in the Argyll and Outer Hebrides area, as I said, and 5 of these are Lepidoptera. So we have the New Forest burnet, as we talked about earlier on, just one site in Ardnamurchan. We have the Talisker burnet on Skye, the slender Scotch burnet pictured here on Tracy's finger on Mull. And what I spent most of my time surveying this summer was the marsh fritillary butterfly and the transparent burnet, which I will now talk about for a few minutes. So in Scotland, they have a pretty restricted distribution to the west coast, so up on Skye, down through the small isles, and on Mull, and on the mainland, on the Ardnamurchan Peninsula, around the Oban area, and down in the south on the Mull of Kintyre. So I've listed these habitat characteristics in this order for a specific reason, and I will be coming back to it, so I hope you're paying attention. So basaltic rock, southern-facing grassy slopes, exposed rock, and most importantly, presence of wild thyme, their sole food plant. All the sites in the Oban area where I did most of my surveying, almost all of them have these 4 characteristics. So for my survey project this summer, I wanted to try and expand our understanding of the distribution of the moth in northern Argyll. And to do this, I surveyed known colonies to aid in annual monitoring efforts, but also to just familiarise myself with what the habitat looked like. I also surveyed historic sites surrounding areas of known colonies to determine extent, and areas of suitable habitat with no records. So I'm going to focus in on that for a second, and I hope you were paying attention. So can anyone tell me what the first habitat requirement was that I mentioned? Yes, well done. So that's the first thing that I considered when I was trying to find suitable habitat for my surveys. So I've mapped the suitable geology here in northern Argyll, and it has whittled that search area down a little bit, but still, obviously, it's a pretty massive area. So to whittle it down further, can anyone tell me what the second habitat requirement was? Yes. So as an example, we'll focus in on this area because that looks like it might be a southern facing slope. And if we zoom in and flip to a topographical map, then I could confirm that yes, that is a southern facing slope. And then to whittle it down even further, could anyone know what the third habitat characteristic was? Exposed rock, yes. Yes. So to confirm that, I'd flip back to an aerial image, and at this scale we can't really see, but if we zoom in a little bit further, then we can confirm that yes, there is some exposed rock here and here. So, sorry, at that stage, I would peel my eyes away from the computer and actually go outside because can't really see the 4th habitat requirement, which was wild thyme for an aerial image. I would go out and survey for wild thyme, and also, depending on the time of year, for larvae or the actual adult butterflies. And I did survey this specific area twice because the first time I went out, I didn't find anything, but I did find a lot of wild thyme, and I thought it looked like a very promising site. But sadly, again, on a revisit, I didn't find any adults either. And this site did have the 4 habitat characteristics or requirements, and it was very near a very robust colony, which is one of our monitoring sites for transparents. So quite disappointing, but I don't really have a definitive answer for why this may be. It could be inappropriate grazing or in a cooler microclimate or something like that, or it could be the recent, so there's supposed to be a photo there, and it's of the exact same area, but it's a more recent aerial image, and it shows that there has been very extensive tree planting here, and it is of broadleafs and rowan and birch, but still not really what you want on potential transparent burnet habitat. But I just use this as an example to highlight why and how important extensive surveying and landowner engagement is. But to go back to my map, these are the points that I dropped when I was doing my search of aerial images, and I was perhaps a bit overzealous with these points because some of them are literally overlapping. They're just meters apart. But still, there's sites here, so I had to prioritize a little bit where I thought would be most worthwhile going. So it was here in south of Lochal. They were quite far away from the nearest transparent burnet colony, so it didn't seem so worthwhile going to those sites. I did visit one of them, but it didn't look very good, and I didn't find anything, of course. And there was other sites that were just really quite inaccessible, and there was a couple of places where I dropped pins that were almost at the height of a Munro, so I was just, for a heat-loving moth, you're probably not going to find it there. I'll get back to what I actually did, what sites I did end up surveying, but I'll just show some nice photos and videos first. So I did end up recording 92 caterpillars altogether, but you can see they can be this darker, blacker colour, but there's a more characteristic sap green colour on the left there. This is what transparent burnet looks like, but on right here, this one looks a bit funny because it's so recently emerged from its chrysalis that its wings haven't fully developed yet. This one was found on a guided walk that I ran with David to Benlong. This one that we found was found by this guy who had travelled all the way from Aberdeenshire to Oban on public transport and stayed overnight in a hostel, all to come to the walk. So I'm really, really glad we still managed to find the end, even just for him. This is what the chrysalis looks like, and just some other interesting findings. I just love the forester moth, so I had to put a picture of it. And I found this one when I was doing habitat monitoring on Ulva with David. Saw it in the grass. I immediately thought I had just trampled a moth, so I freaked out a little bit. But David told me that it had actually just been predated. And that's interesting because it is thought that the burnet moths are under much threat of predation because of those bright colours that indicate to predators that they don't taste very good. But there's just some evidence that, yep, it does happen. So these are the sites that I ended up surveying in the end. So 16 sites. It ended up being about 23 or 24 surveys in the end. And I'll not put the timed counts that I did on the map, but I also did 4 time counts on top of that. And these are the occupied sites in the end. So I ended up extending 3 colonies, and I discovered 4 historic colonies, 3 of which we didn't have the exact locations of. So that was pretty nice. The ones around here, I really thought I had got a whole new site for a minute, but David gleefully told me that there's a 10 kilometre there. So in the end, there was no evidence, finding the evidence that the distribution is drastically changed at all, but we did get some information there, so that was nice. I'll talk a little bit about the marsh fritillary butterfly now. And just for those that aren't familiar with the ecology of the marsh fritillary butterfly, it is a host to a parasitic wasp that lays its eggs inside the marsh fritillary caterpillars, and the parasite eats away at those caterpillars, killing them before emerging and spinning a cocoon in which it pupates. So this creates these boom and bust population cycles of the marsh fritillary. And because the wasp has a quicker life cycle than the marsh fritillary, several generations of the wasp can exploit just one generation of the marsh fritillary. So this is why interconnected network of suitable habitat is really important for the marsh fritillary, so that when these local extinctions occur, the site can be recolonized by a neighbouring colony. So we monitor fritillary butterfly in autumn during the larval period, and we set up transects, which we walk every year, once a year, and count how many larval webs we find. And this This provides us with a reduced effort method that is less dependent on weather, and provides us with data that we can compare year on year. And we can see evidence of these population cycles that I was talking about. So this is an example of one of these transects I spent a lot of time on this late summer, autumn. So what I wanted to see was, what to look at was changes between years, but changes within seasons. So we know that these between years, the populations are very, very dynamic, but I guess I wanted to see if there was any evidence of them being just as dynamic within a season. And just before I go on, I have not parsed through my data yet, so I'll provide some initial observations. I don't have all of my findings yet. But when I was doing the surveys, I had these questions in my mind. So does the number of webs fluctuate throughout the season, or does it follow a more predictable bell curve shape that you would expect? How far do the webs move? Do they split or do they merge? And what the effect of weather was. So while thinking about this, I was questioning whether this would have a bearing on how we interpret our transect data that we collect once a year. So this is the site that I showed you a couple of slides ago, but for my surveys, I chose a half hectare portion of this site and one other to survey week on week. So this is the route that I ended up looking at this site. So I surveyed the entire half hectare portion at this site and one other, and to do that, it ended up being over 3 kilometres of walking, and it took 4.5 hours each time. So it took a lot of time. And I would mark each of the webs that I found with bamboo canes so that I could come back in subsequent weeks and see if they were still there or if they had moved. So this is an example of one of the larval webs, and also some caterpillars about to presumably go to town on that devil's bit scabious leaf. A very flattering photo that Sheena sneakily took of me. And yes, in the initial observations, as with most species that we work on, it was an early season. And we know this already, that there is an impact of weather on surveying larval webs, but it was just, my findings really emphasised that. So at the site that I showed you, I had in total 71 larval webs, but there was 1 or 2 times where I visited that site where there had been some rains in the days prior, and I doubt I would have been able to even find a quarter if I hadn't staked them. And there was no clear or obvious signs of webs splitting or merging. That's not to say it doesn't happen. It could just be that it happens so early in the season that I wasn't able to notice it happening. And there was really high variability in the web. So at all but generally it was somewhere between 20 and 40 centimeters, I'd say. So that's all I have to say about my utility surveys. However, some work parties in the next few months, so if you're in it, please keep an eye on social media or on Assemble. So thank you very much.
Yes, I'm a member of the East Scotland branch. I do a lot of butterfly recording in East Scotland, and kind of persuading other people to join my surveys as well. You will have probably heard me talk about purple hair streaks previously. I've been going on and on and on and on about purple hair streaks for the last few years, and made some good progress in surveying those populations. So yeah, I'll talk about purple hair streaks again, but also other species too. And as Simon mentioned, I'll talk about some new technologies that we're trying to use for surveying, some kind of new methods, of course, so drones, lures, UV light, new kind of innovative ways of surveying. Some people would probably call it cheating, but I'll let you choose. So first of all, drones. So when I do my purple hair streak presentations and engagement, I'm always saying to people how difficult it is to survey this species, and the reason they're so under-recorded is that they fly at the tops of the canopies mostly.
So people doing transects or just looking for butterflies on sunny days, they don't tend to see them because they're out of reach. So people often say, have you tried using a drone? And previously I'd always said, no, I've not tried using a drone, but now I have tried using a drone. So I'll explain what happened here. So the question, might drones allow surveys of hard to reach canopy areas? So best case, hair streaks tolerate and safely avoid the drones. That'd be good. We get good enough video quality to identify which hair streak we're looking at. We're starting to get white-lipped hair streak more and more in Scotland now, so you need to be able to tell which one you're looking at the tops of the trees. This is the two here, purple hair streak on the left, white-lipped hair streak on the right. Fairly distinctive if you're close to them. You can identify them fairly easy. If you're looking up in poor light at the tops of the trees, not so easy. The worst case for drone surveying is hair streaks actually attack the drone and slice into small pieces, which is a risk. If you've seen aggressive butterflies at tops of the trees, you'll see them defending their territories and flying towards anything that moves. Also, the drone gets stuck in a tree. Another risk with this type of survey. Luckily, only one of these things happened. So this is my test area. So this is Kinclave and Bluebell Wood in Perthshire, not too far from my home. It's a good site for purple hair streaks. This is a photograph using my drone. So this is a short video just to give you a rough feel for what kind of view you get when using a drone. I'm not going to use too much video because I'm not necessarily going to work well over the Zoom connection, but just to give you a quick flavour of what I could see while using the drones. You can see plenty of wasps buzzing around there on the canopy. There goes a butterfly. There it goes again. So you start to see just the type of view you get. You can't see anything too detailed. But it's interesting. It's interesting getting this whole different perspective of what things look like from up there and coming back down to earth. So you can't really do a lot of surveying that way. You can't really see what you're looking at. So what you have to do is take your footage back home and start looking at the footage and just freezing it, trying to see what you could see there. This picture here is from the very top of that same tree that we were just looking at. There are two purple hair streaks in that shot. Don't know if anyone can see them. When you're at home on the computer, you're kind of zooming in to try and get a view. So the purple hair streaks are in that area. Might be able to see them. So when you zoom in, that's what you get. So that's good enough. That's good enough to prove that there are purple hair streaks in that tree. And so this is a slightly better shot. Hopefully you can see the purple hair streak there. Top left. So that's a male sitting there with the wings open. So the problem is that the drone has a very wide angle lens on it, so it's a 24mm lens. So even to get this shot of a purple hair streak had to be within 25 centimetres of the butterfly. It's not an easy thing to do when you're flying a drone. It's very nerve-wracking. And this is an example of how not to do it. So yeah, luckily, drone did get stuck in the tree, but yeah, not a good result. I was very nervous a lot of the time doing the survey. So conclusions: it is possible to survey treetop butterflies with a drone, but it's very difficult. The hair streaks, luckily, they seemed able to easily avoid the drone. They're a little bit distracted by it on occasion, but they could easily dodge it. Didn't try to attack it, so no hair streaks were harmed in the making of those videos. Wide angle lens means you have to be very, very close. That's probably the biggest challenge. Obviously, cameras are not designed for this purpose. Drone with collision avoidance would be recommended. I use a very basic DJI Mini 2, very small drone that just fits in the palm of your hand. Doesn't have any of the fancy features more expensive drones have. You can get drones that will try to avoid crashing into the trees in the way that I did. Yes, caution, although no hair streaks were harmed, I wouldn't like to promise that no butterflies would be harmed. They all behave differently. I don't know if you were trying to chase purple emperors with a drone, there's a good chance purple emperors would attack the drone and might come off worst. So I don't know if anybody's tried it down south, but yeah, I would just be cautious. I'm not making any guarantees. So another innovative technique that we wanted to use was UV light. If you've been reading your butterfly conservation magazines, you've probably seen that hair streaks are being surveyed with UV light. Something we were interested to try here to see how it worked. This is the torch that most of us were using for this purpose, 365 nanometer torch, which shows up hair streak caterpillars. It's a torch is obviously not designed for surveying butterflies. It's designed for like crime scene investigation. I think people use them for, and looking for kind of stains and things that you can't see normally. So yeah, just a warning: don't turn off the lights in your kitchen and shine this around the kitchen. You'll be quite horrified at what you thought your clean kitchen looked like. So yes, but it shows up some interesting things that you can't normally see. So this is a picture by Marion Coburn. She was rearing purple hair streaks off from rescued eggs. In the winter, we go out and pick up eggs that have been come down on branches and twigs that have been blown down in the winter. So you can rear them at home. It's not too difficult. You put the egg, attach the eggs to oak twigs, put it in a bottle, treat it like a cut flower, and as long as you can keep feeding them, you can rear purple hair streaks at home. The challenge is actually finding them. So Marion found that she had 5 more fully grown purple hair streak caterpillars than she realised. You might wonder how that could be, but this is what you see without the UV light. There's a large purple hair streak caterpillar in this picture, but you can see how well camouflaged it is. So it's in the top centre of the picture, very, very well camouflaged. So it's quite easy to go through the whole kind of caterpillar life cycle without realising that you've got one right in front of you. This is another example. Not only is the caterpillar camouflaged against the oak kind of twigs there, but it's also wrapped bits of debris around itself with silk. So it's doubly camouflaged. So it's actually there, hidden in amongst the kind of debris of the buds. So you can see why a UV torch can actually be really handy, even just in a captive situation. We've not yet tried this in the wild, so something for us to do. But I think you do have to get quite close to the caterpillars to see them. So it's not like you can just shine your torch around a tree and they kind of ping out. But if you can get close enough to kind of pan your torch over the twigs, then I think it would be very useful. So just to update generally on purple hair streak East Scotland survey, if you've seen my talks before, you know that we've been making a big impact on the range of this species through searching for them in areas where people hadn't really thought to look before. You'd think maybe after 5 years it would be diminishing returns. We're kind of mapping at a 10-kilometre square level. So you think we might have found what there was to find, but actually 2025 showed that wasn't the case at all. We're still turning up lots and lots of new areas for this species. So this was, when I started this kind of awareness raising project to encourage people to look for the butterfly, this was our distribution map for this species. So the coloured dots were where we had records. The open circles is where I thought it was worth looking. So I thought we should be able to fill in those gaps. The question marks were completely speculative. Nobody's ever seen purple hair streaks in these areas. May as well have a look and see what we can find. So about 5 seasons later, this is where we're at. You can see we made a massive difference to the distribution map for purple hair streaks and found them in areas, the question mark areas that I'd marked, and beyond, areas that I hadn't even thought to put a question mark on because I thought they were way outside of range. Up on Speyside there, we managed to find them. So 2025 is the blue circles. This is where we first found this species in that 10k square. South of the Forth, a huge difference even just this year. So up on Dee's side, Patrick Cook and Mark Tasker found them around Banchory, which is a whole new area, a big discovery up there. Gill and Jeff Ballinger discovered a lot of these records down in the Lothians, partly through finding adult butterflies in the summer, partly through egg surveys in the winter. It's one of the few butterflies that you can survey in the winter, so it keeps some of us busy picking up oak twigs and finding the eggs. And Ian Cower did a good few 10k squares down in the borders as well. So yeah, I think this butterfly's been there all along, but it's just the awareness of how to find this particular species that behaves quite differently to many of the others. So 20 new 10-kilometre squares just in 2025, which is about as good as any of the year that we've had. Moving on, so white letter hair streak, you might have heard that it turned up in Dundee last year. It was a bit of a surprise. It was first found in Scotland in 2017 by Ian Cow, just across the border with England. It was found in 2024 by Keith Edwards, who's here today. This is his picture. I believe he thought he was taking a picture of a purple hair streak at the time on a buddleia in his garden. And it was only later that he realised that he was actually looking at a white letter hair streak, which was completely unexpected because they'd only just been found in Edinburgh that same week. So how they arrived in Edinburgh and Dundee at the same time is a bit of a mystery. So Keith lives next to a park which has some very mature kind of planted tree elms. So he quickly tracked down the white letter hairstreak to Victoria Park, where he could see the white letter hairstreaks at the tops of the trees. He was also amazingly able to find an egg on a windfall elm branch over the winter. So this is a picture of Keith's white letter hairstreak egg. He reattached it to an elm tree in the spring, and managed to track the early life stages of the caterpillar in the spring. So this is a picture of the seed pods of an elm tree, and the caterpillar has tunneled holes into the seed pod and eaten the seeds. So you get these kind of missing seeds on the elm pods in the spring is one way to find the feeding damage of the very early stages. And Keith has managed to track the early instars of the caterpillar. So I went down and we managed to get this picture, quite well camouflaged against the elms. And there's a zoomed in picture of the egg there. You can see it looks like a rivet head nailed into the twig. To me, they're much harder to find than purple hairstreak eggs. So yeah, I don't know how Keith managed to find that one. It was a great find. So we were very keen to work out how they arrived in Dundee. So that was our project for 2025, was to survey the area around Dundee to try and figure out a vector for in which direction had they come from. So we identified plenty of good habitat around Dundee, lots of suitable sites with nice sheltered areas and plenty of elms. So we had a target list of areas to check. Keith and Barry Foxon managed to find plenty more white letter hairstreak in the park and in the immediate area around the first discovery, mostly using a kind of a telescope to identify them because they're up at the top of some very large trees. So I managed to establish that they're doing quite well in the park. I managed to find a new site at Nine Wells near the hospital, which is about 2.5 kilometres west. So that was, a decent increase in our knowledge of where they occur around Dundee. It was quite difficult for me to get any proof that I'd seen a white letter hairstreak up in the tree, so I resorted to the drone again. There is a white letter hairstreak in this picture. You can probably see it in the middle. And that's the zoomed in version. So Ian Cow assured me that that's definitely a white letter hairstreak. I would have been kind of hesitant to use it as proof, but Ian's the expert, and he said, yeah, that's clearly a white letter hairstreak. So yeah, after spending quite a lot of time and effort trying to get some evidence that I'd seen it, Keith went down and got this picture a few days later. White letter hairstreak at low levels. So next time I'm just going to leave it to Keith to get that. So this shows our survey areas. These are all the habitats that we'd earmarked as potential sites. All the red crosses show areas where we didn't find them. We didn't find them. Some possibilities, but purple hairstreaks were getting in the way as well, so you couldn't quite be confident you'd seen a white letter hairstreak. So yeah, still a bit of a mystery where they came from exactly. So conclusions. Purple hairstreaks, I've always told people not to bother looking for them during the day and to look at oak trees. While we were looking for white letter hairstreaks, I discovered that they do fly during the day and they sit in elm trees, which wasn't helping at all when we were trying to survey white letter hairstreaks. Confirming the difference between the two is difficult. Quite often I was getting excited by a butterfly that I thought was probably a white letter hairstreak, but they turned out to be purple hairstreaks active during the day. So we haven't got a clue how they arrived in Dundee yet. So if anyone's interested in helping out, especially in Fife, be interested to see if we can track any down between Dundee and Edinburgh. Another mystery, so I was keen to go over and prove that white letter hairstreaks were in Dumfries and Galloway because they've been established in the Carlisle area for a good few years. They've travelled a long way up the east coast in that time. So I was convinced that there would be white letter hairstreaks in Dumfries and Galloway. So planned out a survey there, went over and looked for them. Couldn't find them at all. And not only could I not find any butterflies, but the elms themselves had no feeding damage at all. Normally, if you find a good site for white letter hairstreaks, you see the leaves at the top of the elm trees are quite ragged and being eaten by caterpillars. The elms at Dumfries and Galloway, they're all very clean and uneaten. So I kind of convinced myself that they were not white letter hairstreaks in Dumfries and Galloway. So how they haven't moved at all on the west coast, but they've moved along on the east coast is a mystery. So moving on to another species, so mountain ringlet. So I'm the I-Record verifier for the East Perthshire Vice County. There's never been mountain ringlets recorded in this Vice County, but got this record of a Scotch Argus from Dallencardock Estate from Sam Buckland, and luckily it's a misidentified mountain ringlet. So that was our first mountain ringlet recorded in the East Perthshire Vice County. And as often happens, shortly afterwards, there was another credible report came from the same Vice County by Shona Robertson at the Cairnwell Summit in Glenshee. So from never having a mountain ringlet record in East Perthshire, as far as I'm aware, we went to having 2 good possibilities. So this is a view from the Cairnwell. I followed up Shona's record up onto the top of the Cairnwell using the chairlift. And I really don't like chairlifts, so it takes quite a lot to get me to go on a chairlift. But the prospect of finding mountain ringlets got me up there, and I managed to find good habitat, but I didn't find the butterfly, so it's still a survey project. So this shows the Vice County, and the red circles show the two new sightings. There's a very interesting population out there to the east in the Angus Glens at Glendall, and then there's a big gap over to the main populations over in the west. So we've got this new area. Got some encouragement to believe that there's mountain ringlets between the Glendall population and the ones over in the central Perthshire. So yeah, this just shows a little bit more detail of the area of search. Anyone who's keen on hill walking and would be interested in helping us with this, I'd be very interested to hear from you. So these are some of the areas, some fantastic mountain scenery up there. So a very, very nice way to spend a summer's days looking for mountain ringlets on some of these flowery hillsides in this area. So this is what we're looking for. Mat grass is the food plant, so that's essential. And then they tend to be associated with these 4 nectar plants as well. So if you have those 5 plants together, then you've got the right kind of habitat. So yeah, this is a mountainous territory. Not many butterfly surveyors tend to spend a lot of time going up there. I noticed that Patrick Cook had mentioned that it had a bit of success with the Alpine coffee moth, and he thought that was, he mentioned, to get people to go up and do surveys of this kind of micro moth. He thinks it's because the name's quite attractive. People like the idea of going searching for a coffee moth. So I'm thinking what we need to do here is start looking for the chocolate fudge cake with caramel sauce of that mountain ring. So if that sounds advertising to anybody, then please get in touch, and we'll see if we can fill in this big historical gap between the populations. Another species I want to talk about, the wall, which is the one that's been moving fastest on the east in 2025. It's been in Fife and up the east coast for a while, but this year it really got established in Dundee. You can see there's a lot of records in Dundee, people finding it in their gardens. So this is the first year that that's been the case, and it's Perthshire's newest butterfly. Every year in the past 3 years, we've had a new butterfly species arrive in Perthshire. So it was the wall in 2025. So the first record was Simon Watson at Canoe Hill, 26th of July. Immediately following that, over the next few days, we had them popping in various places around Perth. One way out there in Crieff, a long way outside. The previous range has obviously been moving quite fast. And there was a really interesting one up there at the top of the map by Bruce Philp. So this is about 20 miles north. So within 2.5 weeks of the first sighting in Perthshire, there was another one 20 miles north, and that wasn't just a single one. That was at least 2 butterflies flying around a hilltop, and that was interesting because I'd gone to look at walls in North Fife in the spring, and gone to Norman's Law, which is a known site, and not seeing the walls around the kind of the nice habitat at the base of the hill. But when you get to the top of the hill, I saw wall browns flying around chasing each other, nectaring on the small number of dandelions that were up there. And then Elspeth Christie mentioned it. She'd seen the same thing in Fife. You go to the tops of the hills, and that's where the walls are. So it's very interesting. And Bruce Philp's record up at kind of Ashmore Hill, up at Bridge of Cally, that was the same. He'd seen a couple of walls around the hilltop in an area where there's no walls for miles around, and that seems likely that they were hilltopping. So this is a behaviour that mostly migrant butterfly species adopt when there are low numbers of maybe just coming in at the start of the season. They need to find mates. The kind of habitat generalists, really, so there isn't really an obvious location for them to gather. So they head to the top of the hills, and they manage to find mates at the top of the hills and the whole territories up there. So that was interesting. So I did Google this, and it turns out that walls do this as well. So it seems like that's what we've seen is hilltopping walls. So again, if you're out hill walking, check around the hilltops. You quite often see a kind of painted ladies, red admirals, things like that, even if you haven't been seeing them on the rest of your walk. And the same thing applies to walls. So a good way to find new areas for this species. And you see there's a big gap now north of Perth and all the way up to Bridge of Cally. Anywhere in that area of Perthshire, that I guess there's a chance of finding wolves on the tops of the hills. Okay, so move on. So another kind of piece of technology that I tried for the first time this year was lures. So there's more and more lures are becoming available. So these apply to moths. So I don't normally do a lot of moth surveying, but this was kind of very intriguing to me whether we could use this technique to do surveys. So targeted a few rare moths that are known that lures are available for them now, but they're not well known. So that if you take a lure out into an area where this moth is not currently known, there's a chance of making a significant discovery. So this was a wood, took a lure out for large red-belted cleaning out to a wood not far from my home in an area where there'd not been this moth seen at all. It's a brand new unrecorded site, and it only took a few minutes actually for this to happen. So the lure is there in this old jewellery bag, just hanging up. You hang it up, preferably on a breezy day, so that the pheromone simulation spreads around the wood and it attracts the male moths. So this is not 5 moths. This is just one moth. Me putting together the composite and action sequence showing. So I was quite pleased with that picture because I was under a lot of pressure from my wife shouting at me to get a photograph. So I was quite pleased I managed to get a good section of pictures. I did go back a couple of weeks later, and I was lucky enough to find a female laying eggs. So what they do is they use the cut stumps of birch. They lay their eggs between the bark and the kind of the trunk of the cut birch, and did look around in quite a few areas for this moth, and it was only right next to a cut felled birch did you actually find one. So that was interesting. And then apparently later on in the year, you can see frass coming out from within the bark that's created by the caterpillars. So encouraged by this, I tried another species. So this is the lunar hornet moth, again, just close to our house in an area where they'd never been seen before, and was also successful there. Didn't take too long to find that. An amazing looking moth, very, very much like a wasp. So I guess they're very under-recorded. A lot of people would see these in passing and just assume it was a wasp, but in fact it was this kind of rare cleaving. So I guess, as David was saying, they're not as rare as people thought, but this new kind of technology is allowing us to uncover the distribution in ways that weren't possible before. So that's everything I've got for you. So just a couple of thanks. Thanks to Peter Eels, who he provides a lot of photographs for me for using in my composite life cycle composite images that you've seen in this presentation. Simon Watson as well. Malcolm Haddow helped me plan the Dumfries and Galway to hairstreak survey, which wasn't successful, but he was a great help in identifying target locations. My email address is here. If anyone's interested in anything I've been talking about and would like to get involved or wants to follow up later, feel free to get in touch. And lastly, my usual plea to enter your records into iRecord. I rely heavily on iRecord to gather the latest information on what's where and know what to look for next. So please do. There's lots of ways to record your records, but iRecord is the one that lets everybody see what you're doing instantly without having to kind of hunt around or fill in forms to get access to data and everything. So, and Butterfly Conservation do encourage use of iRecord. So that's from my selfish point of view, being able to see what's going on. That's definitely the right place to put your records. Okay, thank you very much.
Hi everyone. So it's not all going to be moths and butterflies in my presentation, but the hope is that it'll inspire you to inspire others on moths and butterflies. So thank you for the intro. I'll skip my little intro in that, but just because of my wildlife filmmaking background, Anthony and I thought it'd be nice to give a quick rundown on science communication in some form, and I'm going to go into social media. So I'll be specifically focusing upon Instagram in my examples, but it can be applied to any of the other platforms like Facebook or YouTube. And a lot of you will already be very familiar with the lingo here, but it's just to give a good starting foundation. So apologies if there's any kind of repeat information. So even just the words social media, I feel, can have quite often negative connotations, and we naturally shy away from it. But social media can, in fact, be equally used as a force for good. You know, just from an environmental conservation perspective, we can harness its power to, connect with audiences that would otherwise not have it within their kind of field of interest, globally network with other like-minded people, and also inspire, communicate our findings to these larger audiences. I'd also like to make it clear that this is just from my point of view. They're not super well-researched facts. It's just what I've learned from my own experience. And sorry, thank you. Yeah, sure. Sorry. So it's just what I've learned from my own experience and from others in the field. If you have any questions, feel free to ask at the end or anytime afterwards. So on that, let's start. So start off with, when it comes to putting yourself on social media, whether that's directly your face on screen or through the captioning on your videos, it's vital to not only safeguard your audience, but yourself too. And because, social media, though it can be a wonderful place with the ability to meet new people and have new collaborations, it can at times lead to less pleasant encounters too. So as you continue to develop your online presence, we really need to think about, as an individual, what parts of ourselves we want to share. Just as an example, if you're taking pictures of the butterflies and moths you see in the same place near your house, it's a lot easier to kind of triangulate and pinpoint where you live. So when I am posting up photos, I tend to say D-side rather than, my home village. It's not meant to scaremonger. No one's going to come like breaking down your door because I was like, ooh, butterfly in my garden. But it's just something we need to consider. Safety is the top priority here. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to protect that. We have to look after ourselves as well as nature. And speaking of individuality, that brings me to the next part of the boring stuff, which is your persona. I just wanted to fit a swallow-tailed moth in somewhere. It's not related to this one. And when I say persona, I'm referring to your online self or account. So again, this includes both in text and on screen. Who do you want to be? Because if you're starting out social media wise, you've got a lovely clean slate. And that means that you can decide not only how you communicate, but who you're going to be interacting with. And that can range from the purpose of your account, the target demographic of your audience, to the main media format you're going to use. Again, for example, on Instagram, my own account is more or less intended for wildlife communication and conservation education. And that's at an age bracket of around 12 and upwards. That also means the language I generally use is easy to understand, but not to the point it's patronizing. Since I occasionally also do interact with children, I'm not saying the F word in every other sentence. A social media account can also, differ from the user's in-person presence, similar in the same way to how we may be more formal at work compared to at home. And that just means you're not giving away all of yourself to the public, you're reaching the audience you intend to, and you're protecting both them and yourself at the same time. Again, this is a personal choice, and you might actually find simply having a diary account of your day-to-day activities is the perfect fit for what you're trying to achieve, but personal decision nonetheless. And when you're being your persona, expressing opinion is another essential aspect to keep in mind. I saw a very silly, but it's turned out to be annoyingly catchy saying, which is pause before you post. And again, sounds obvious, but sometimes when we're emotionally overcome, whether that's by a reported incident like environmental disaster or an intense reaction we've just had, our words don't come out in the way that we want them to. So I tend to find I'm much more eloquent and able to elaborate on what's concerning me the day after. Again, I'd recommend you write up your initial post, create a draft of some form, and just sleep on it. Then you can reread it again the day of posting. But if you're comfortable, or if the nature of the event means you need to post your information straight away, I would have a friend or a trusted associate double check it for you. And then if you manage to survive all that boring stuff and remember to apply it to your wonderful photos, then firstly, well done. And secondly, how do we make sure it remains yours? And that leads me on to copyright. Because social media, again, completely free and accessible platform where we can share our creative work globally. but the downside is that it's simultaneously accessible to others for blatant theft. There's not a lot we can do about that in terms of if it's a concept or, you know, an idea rather than a tangible piece of work, but there are measures we can put in place to help prevent it, or at the least deter, you know, said creative thieves. You could mention within your account description, also known as a bio, the images are copyright of your name. This way, if anyone does directly decide to copy and paste an image, you have the ability to demonstrate you've warned beforehand. For content that urgently requires minimal risk of theft, I would recommend a watermark, a signature, or logo of some form to make sure it doesn't happen. But if it does, you know, don't lose help. I think gaining the awareness that it could occur is half the battle, and it will help in the long run for building the mental fortitude towards it. Now, finally, onto the fun stuff. So, what makes a post popular? I've decided to use a bunch of bananas as an example, just because I can. And at times, you know, it can be really difficult to actually make your post popular. How do you manage to actually reach that audience you're looking to communicate with? And consistency definitely plays a role in breaking that barrier. So once you begin posting, try to keep that daily streak going for as long as you can. Adding extra auditory or visual elements is another sure way of, you know, capturing more attention. So trending music or actions included in posts puts you in an even better position. And try to make full use of hashtags. So on Instagram, for example, you can use up to 30 hashtags, and these can be included at the bottom of your caption. So I would recommend about 5 hashtags, and that should be tailored to the audience you're hoping to reach. And then also the time and day that you post can change the level of exposure your post receives. And if you use the @ symbol, you can tag other accounts that are related to your post. So I've got here Fife's Official, which is an Irish banana brand. And if I was posting about a bunch of bananas, I'd try and make it when banana farmers are having their first tea break. So that's just one of the many, many factors to consider if you're hoping to make your post popular. And when it comes to making videos, when you're starting out, cutting and editing together lots of various video clips can be really tricky. So one of the most common types of video to capture just in singular, like one shot format, would be an interview. And here are my top 5 and fast tips for if you do decide to hold an interview, because that way you can tell a whole story or even scientific information on a subject by interviewing an expert. So first of all, ask a warm-up question. No one likes having a camera pointed straight at them and being told, how do we solve world peace? So a conversational kind of question like, what did we have for breakfast? Or something along those lines is a good way to put the interviewee at ease. I would also say you should, recommend that you would include the question in the answer. Just ask the interviewee if they can do that. It's good practice to follow in an interview, reminding them exactly why they're answering, and also gives them a little bit of time to think over their answers, reducing the case of early stutters. It also means when you're looking back over the video, you're not wondering, like, what were they talking about? And then my third pointer is to let the conversation flow naturally. Once the camera's going, you should just let the interviewee talk normally. If they divulge from the original question or add extra bits in, don't pause or interrupt them. Just have the shortened answer afterwards. Sometimes actually those longer or different answers work out better than the original take. And then the other fourth piece of information would be, piece of advice would be to keep quiet. As you can probably tell, I like rambling a lot, and it's surprisingly difficult when someone's speaking with you not to hum or say yes in agreement. But later, when you're editing, you'll be able to hear yourself in the background rather than the person talking. So it's better to just maintain an open, easy demeanor and simply smile whilst nodding to acknowledge you're listening. And my fifth and final tip is to keep the camera running, even after you've said that the interview's finished, because normally just at the end of a conversation, five times out of 10, the interviewee will go, oh gosh, I remembered, I forgot to say this, or they had an extra bit of information they wanted to tell. And 9 times out of 10, that extra part will be the bit that they're happiest with. And my last tip to you all is don't be afraid to think outside the box. Whether it's captioning, your wildlife photos, or you're filming a communicative piece, dare to be different. It might feel a little bit cringy at first, or especially when it's something that no one else has tried before, but it's kind of those things that capture other people's attention and get you heard above the noise. And if it all goes well, you'll all be inspiring a whole new audience to care about moths and butterflies too. Thank you for listening. Any questions?
Yeah, I've been given special permission to talk about bats as well as moths. So thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm Daisy, and as was introduced, I'm a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh, and my supervisors are Dr. Alfie Gaythorne-Hardy, who's based at Edinburgh as well, and Dr. Barbara Smith, who's based in Coventry at the Centre for Agroecology, Water and Resilience. So that's my background. And I'm exploring the focus of my PhD is an approach to agriculture that I call polyculture. And that's the simultaneous cultivation of many, many different crop species mixed together in close proximity in the same field. So rather than having a monoculture of one crop, you've got a mixture. And I'm looking at the potential of polyculture in the UK to bridge the currently usually conflicting, unfortunately, priorities of food production on the one hand and biodiversity conservation on the other. So polyculture can take many forms, but my research is focused on market gardening. And for me, market gardens, I don't know how many of you are familiar with a market garden or a community garden, an urban garden. They're really the kind of ultimate example for me of what polyculture can look like in the UK. So they're typically very small in scale, as one pictured here, but they might feature tens to hundreds of different crop types in really closely intermingled arrangements. And typically as well, a lot of wild plants. The gardeners might call them weeds, or some of us might call them weeds mixed in there as well. They're lovely places. And just how close to this do I have to stand? I feel a bit, can you hear me if I'm back here? Is that okay? Thank you, give me a bit more space. So a little bit of a sort of background overview of the rationale for this study. Ecological theory tells us that ecosystems that are more diverse, that contain more species, tend to be more productive. They tend to produce more stuff at the level of the plants, and then so on beyond that. And market gardeners aim to harness this relationship between diversity and productivity in their fields. So they can design their gardens in these very complex and careful arrangements where complementary partnerships between crops are maximised, so crops that go well together, and the ones that might be more competitive are minimised, so that collectively the crops can make optimal use of the resources for growth within the field, so the nutrients, the water, the light, etc. And ideally different crop species, you can see here there's a really nice messy mix, but they might even help each other along by, for example, providing shelter or structural support. For example, the corn here might provide support for a trellis of beans or something like that, and beautifully, some of the crops might invite beneficial insects into the field, or they might deter less beneficial ones. So ideally, you want a mutually beneficial ecosystem developing between the crops. And the idea is that the crops make use of, rather than a monoculture, there's one ecological niche that all the crops are occupying. In a polyculture, they're making use of diverse niches. And then in turn, a polycultural cropping system can provide additional niches for other organisms to occupy. So again, in contrast to a monoculture, a uniform habitat, polycultures create this complex, diverse mosaic of different niches and different habitats and different resources for other species. So the hypotheses based on this background, big up the butterfly there. The hypotheses that I'm testing are that polycultures can provide, one, higher biodiversity than your conventional organic cropping. And by conventional, I mean organic fields that have one crop in them, that are a monoculture, still better than industrial, sort of chemical heavy industrial agriculture, but still they don't have that diversity at the level of the plants. And then boldly, I'm also hypothesizing that at an area-based level, polycultures can also produce higher yields than conventional industrial cropping. In this talk, I'm going to focus on my research on biodiversity because I think that that's the interest that we all share. So a little overview of my methods. I've done 2 field seasons so far in my PhD, and I'm going to focus on the first one because I've had longer to think about it and look at the data. So my first field season took place in 2023, a little while ago now. And this was a really intensive period of data collection at 10 field sites around southern Scotland. So, oh yeah, the pointer, that's good. So 6 of the field sites were composed of a market garden polyculture, plus a next door conventionally managed field of barley. And barley offered itself to me conveniently as a comparator crop because of its ubiquity all over these parts. So all of the market gardens happen to be next to a barley field. So I will use barley as a monocultural example. But polycultures tend to be managed organically, and barley in general is managed conventionally. So I had to add a third element into this design. I also had 4 sites where I had a field of barley directly next door to a field of organic barley next to a field of conventional barley. And this 3-way design allowed me to test the impact of diversity, polyculture versus monoculture, against the impact of management, organic versus conventional at these sites. And at each site, I had my field of interest, the polyculture, right over the hedge or right over the fence from the barley field. And in both fields simultaneously, one after the other, I would conduct botanical surveys, light trapping for moths, and acoustic surveys of bat calls. Just flip over the page here. And I'll just start with the bats. So I used small acoustic recorders called audio moths to survey the calls of bats as they fly and forage above the fields. And an audio moth is nothing to do with a moth, unfortunately, but it's a small microphone and it's capable of recording sound in the ultrasonic range. So that sounds higher than we can hear with the naked ear. And I chose bats because almost a quarter of the UK's mammal species are bats. We've got 18 species in total, and all of the species of bats we have are insectivorous. So because of their reliance on insects for food, including moths, they make a really brilliant ecological indicator because sites that host more bats are likely to host more insects and then the rest of the food chain that supports these in turn. So here you can see some examples of some characteristic bat calls of 4 different species, and we can use these visualizations of the calls as well as listening to them to try and figure out who said what in the recordings. And I would leave my recorders going for 3 nights in the field, so then I could go away and have a nice time while the recorders collected all the data. And if I missed anything there, no, I think that's it. In addition, now we get into the bit that you're interested in. I set light traps in the field for a single night at each paired site, one in the polyculture and one in the monoculture. And you'll notice the butterfly conservation bucket trap, and my thanks go out to Mark for building those traps and also letting me help him build them. It was great fun. So I was really interested in the impact of the actual cropping on the moths. So rather than placing the traps at the edge, where I'm sure I would have got a lot more moths in my traps at the edge where all the trees and the hedges are, I placed my traps a good distance out into each field, hopefully meaning that I wasn't sampling from the edge. You never know how many moths did actually come out from the edge. But there's my friend being strongly attracted to the light in the barley field. So I knew the trap was working, and there's my trap in the polyculture field. That's what it looked like. And okay, so the next 3 slides are my homage to the moths. So at other conferences, I put up this slide, which shows the really colourful ones, and everyone goes, "Woo, wow." But for you guys, I've got 3 slides, and then this is just a sample. And also, I'm suddenly terribly nervous that I might have misidentified one, because I was a complete beginner. So again, tell me at the end, or you can call out. You can call out. I don't mind getting. So these are my favourite moths that I encountered in the field, and I collectively over the 2 years I've been surveying moths in the field, I found 115 different species, which might seem like very little. It might seem like a lot if I don't know if you're used to agricultural environments or more wild habitats. Oh no, where's the lesser broad-bordered yellow underwing gone? It's actually a really cool headshot of its face close up. Oh well. And actually all the labels have got a bit funny, never mind, sorry about that. But yeah, you might have spotted some of your friends amongst the moths there. Okay, and as you guys are a moth audience, I thought I'd just give a little nod to some of the commoner species. These are ones that sort of stand out in my data as being the commonest in the polycultures and the commonest in the monocultures, and they are very ubiquitous and common species anyway. But what kind of makes a lot of sense is that the species that turned up most frequently in the monocultures tend to be the grass-feeding species often, and this is based on Waring and Townsend's larval food plant information. Often they're known to feed on cereal crops as well as wild grass species. And then in the polycultures, the same 4 species were also common. You'll see them in the list here. But in addition to them, other common species included many whose larval food plants were the broad-leaved herbaceous plants, so including the docks and the nettles and the goosefoots and the plantains and the fat hen. And it was lovely to see this because I was also doing these botanical surveys, and those are the weed flora of the market gardens, and they tend to be very weedy in a positive way. They tend to be full of these lovely wild plants in between the crops. And so that's an example, I think, of one of the ways in which these systems are very beneficial for wild species. But what I'm really interested to know, and I know absolutely nothing about, is how many of these species might also feed on the floral nectar of the crop species. Because I'd be so interested if the crops themselves actually have a direct benefit for the moths that occupy these habitats. I don't know. If anybody knows, then I'd love to have a chat. And if anybody's got any interesting insights into how I might interpret some of the patterns I'm seeing, I'd really love a chat. So come and find me. I don't know how much, am I running out of time? It's the end anyway, nearly the end. Thank you very much. I always want to thank the farmers who invited me onto their sites really generously and supported me to do the work there. To you guys, to Butterfly Conservation, for help with learning about moth trapping in the early stages, to the British Trust for Ornithology as well, who helped me with my methods, to my friends who came into the field with me and did a lot of voluntary labour, and to my funders. And then very, very lastly, one of these friends, Margaret, she's a Perth-based artist, and she came into the field with me a lot, and she made lots of beautiful artwork based on her experience of joining me in survey work. And I just thought you'd appreciate this. And can you shout out the name of the moth? Yeah, thank you. So we made she mainly made a body of artwork that's now an exhibition about field. It's called Field Studies, and it's artwork about field work, and it's up in the Ecology building in Edinburgh University, which is where I'm based, which is Crewe. So if anybody ever frequents Edinburgh and wants to grab my email address and would like to come and see the work, there's lots of moth work in there, and you'd be really welcome to come and see it. So thank you very much.
Right, hello. So I was lucky enough this year to win the Dacia Award, which was unbelievable. And I used the money to go and do this surveying in the Cairngorms. As Patrick's just said to me, I think I had the best weather that the Cairngorms has ever seen while I was there. And as you'll see in the pictures. The focus for my project was to look at the moths and Alpine regions, and whether or not the moths could be used as a mechanism for tracking climate change. Specifically, this species is incredibly rare in the UK. It's only found in the Cairngorms. This study examines this day-flying moth, and it's restricted to the southern portion of the Cairngorm mountain range. Alpine moths have been studied as useful indicators of climate change because their distributions can change relatively quickly and in response to temperature and related factors. So studies that I have read as part of my master's compare invertebrate presence across mountain ranges over time and show movement upwards with a 33% loss of butterfly habitat, for instance, in central Spain over the course of 30 years. So the mountain or Scotch burnet is an alpine species of day-flying moth. The moth measures 25 to 33 millimeters. And annoyingly, I have realized that I haven't put a picture of the moth in there. I've only put pictures of the caterpillar in there. It has a black-haired body with grayish wings and 4 red spots. The caterpillar form, as you can see here, is black with yellow spots. It overwinters as a caterpillar and emerges late spring into summer to feed, pupate, and breed. It has been observed to only fly in sunshine with little wind, which sometimes makes it difficult to spot in the Cairngorms. And the length of its life cycle is disputed. So various studies of this species, Hagvar, he's a Norwegian scientist, recorded it as yearly in his extensive study of it, but other scientific groups believe that it has a 2-yearly cycle. Hagvar suspected that a bank of individuals hibernate for 2 annual cycles as an insurance against poor weather. So there would always be a smaller number that would emerge if 1 year's worth of caterpillars all died out because the weather was too poor. It's also present in Scandinavia, the Alps and the Pyrenees, as I'll show you in the next slide. I tried to give myself the best chance of getting good data on the species by choosing to survey the caterpillars rather than the moths, as they're slightly less mobile and they're easier to count. I also decided to survey the botanical makeup of the colony sites and the vegetation height. The species is distributed across the European Alps, the Pyrenees, Scandinavia, Russia, and Scotland. Genetic studies of this species suggest that the distribution in the Alps and the Pyrenees, this goes back to what Mark was saying earlier, are similar enough that they're likely to be part of one population before the warming period of the Holocene. The geographic proximity between the Norwegian and the Scottish populations make it possible that these now disjunct populations were once also one, but there hasn't been a genetic study into the reasons or to prove that. As climate warmed after the last ice age, populations in the UK were isolated, likely first to northern regions and then into mountainous regions. And the current population is limited to the Cairngorm region in Scotland, which is also the coldest part of the UK. Mountains in the west of Scotland that are of similar altitude do not get such consistently cold conditions due to the influence of the tropical maritime weather system. The impact of current rapid warming on the mountain burnet in the Pyrenees has been studied by Dika, who used records from 1958, 1986, and surveying in 2008, 2009 to try and measure any upward movement of the moth. And he showed an increase in 87 meters of altitude per decade, and in 4 sites where there were previously records, the mountain burnet had become locally extinct. Comparison studies have not been undertaken in Scandinavia, probably because previous data isn't available. If a similar upward shift occurs in the UK population, it's more likely to result in a complete extinction, as the cairngorms are not as high and the population does not have the same room to colonize upward. So the aim of my study was to research the ecological niche of this mountain burnet in the United Kingdom. I hypothesized that the reason for its small distribution was due to the shrinking of viable habitat caused by warming temperatures. If true, I predicted that the abundance of the mountain burnet would increase with altitude. To address this, I plan to take samples at every 50 meters of elevation from the lowest recorded occupied elevation to the highest recorded occupied point. However, this wouldn't explain why the moth is so geographically constrained to the area just around Braemar, when other areas of the same altitude are available in proximate geographic locations. I hypothesized that this was due to particular botanical need, which would promote high abundance. And if true, then the percentage cover of individual botanical species would correlate with high moth abundance and show the preference, which could then use to explore why the range of the species is so limited. So just to run you through the sites, we've got Moraine in the south here, which is the which is the largest site. This was quite botanically diverse in that it had drier areas, it had wetter areas, it had areas with small amounts of bog in it. Carn Droghade, which was very, very small and really isolated to the very top of the mountain. Carn Leith, which was incredibly dry. It was characterized by this, these bands of shale that went all the way down the mountain. And while the botanical makeup, or there wasn't any particular species in each site which dominated any other, the dryness or moisture levels in each site became very important. Carnardoch here was a bog. It's a blanket bog located on the side of the mountain, and quite different in character to the rest of the sites. And finally, the highest one here was very small, not anywhere near as large as this colony location size would say, and was located almost at the very top of the mountain, just over 1,000 meters. So during the course of my surveying, I walked 160 kilometers, and I recorded data for 250 quadrats. And there you can see on the left, Patrick, who kindly came up and helped me survey, which was absolutely amazing. On the right here, you can see my GPS track for the 2 weeks. And the longest day that I had was a 30-kilometer day into Bernard, and then back out, which was quite a trek. And I was glad that the days were long. As you can see, the weather that I got during the surveying period was pretty unusual. I had 2 weeks of solid sunshine, no cloud, no rain. This made finding the caterpillars pretty easy because they are incredibly energetic when the sun's out. So 2 results then. So of the 5 sites that I surveyed, only 2 were spread out over multiple altitudes. These were Carn Leith and Moraine. The other sites were occupied only at 1 altitude, which makes some of the data analysis difficult, as you'll see in a second. The quality of the data was good, and I was lucky to locate the caterpillars in all of the sites. I recorded data in 20 quadrats for each elevation at the multi-altitudinal sites and 30 in single elevation sites to try and get good data on the botanical character of each site. I measured the average height of the vegetation by taking 4 measurements and averaging them and recording the cover. Over the course of the 2 weeks, I counted 1,673 caterpillars in all. And I began dreaming about them as well. So, as with other alpine species, I expected that there would be either a straight correlation with the altitude gain, or that I would see a unimodal distribution where the abundance peaked at a particular altitude. However, when I really dug into the data, only population at one site, which was Morone, showed this distribution, with no altitude showing as statistically preferable across all the sites. You can see this in the graphs here, which theoretically show a preference for the 750 to 800 meters elevation. But when I broke the data down into sites and ran statistical tests, that didn't turn out to be significant. It occurred to me, given the character of the Cairngorms, where the vegetation is shaped by the harsh winds, that perhaps there was a relationship between the abundance and the distance from the summit. And I worked out the distance of each quadrat from the peak of the mountain, graphed the abundance by very close, close, medium, and far. And this did show a statistically significant relationship where, regardless of the actual elevation, the proximity to the peak was correlated with the abundance of the caterpillar. The second statistically significant finding that I had was a correlation between the presence of moss and abundance. Three of the sites had a significant amount of moss, both aerocarp and sphagnum, for those of you that are interested in bryophytes, which were correlated with high numbers of caterpillars. There could be two reasons for this. That higher levels of soil moisture had a positive impact on caterpillar survival, or that it offered camouflage from predators. And certainly I and Patrick both observed them diving from stalks of heather into the moss, which was it's very interesting to watch. These moisture indications fit in with observations by the Norwegian scientist that I mentioned earlier, Hagvar, who under controlled conditions increased soil moisture and saw an increase in the abundance of the moth. So in this case, sorry, poor photography, and I was so concerned with getting enough data that I actually didn't take that many pictures. This is the sphagnum moss with the heather poking through, and this was the most abundant sites. The quadrats which had the largest number of caterpillars in them were like this. In one quadrat, I counted 98 caterpillars. Another example. And there's just a caterpillar in the middle there. He's just about to dive off, but then I missed him dropping off. So the feeding data showed that caterpillars mainly survived on heather. This is in contrast to the research of this moth in Scotland elsewhere, which suggested that it survived mainly on crowberry. When this was compared against its availability in the environment, however, cowberry and cloudberry were actually more positively selected, i.e. they were eaten far beyond their availability in the environment, like the chocolate bar of the botanical world. This is in contrast to the existing literature, which mainly listed crowberry as being the key feeding plant for this species. So my conclusions then. These caterpillars displayed a preference for certain positions on the mountain. So rather than preferring specific altitudes where they were most abundant in the area just below the summit of the peak, where the wind keeps the vegetation below 20 centimeters. This was statistically significant, with abundance decreasing with distance from the summit rather than peaking or falling with a specific altitude. They do display a preference for eating specific vegetation, potentially wildly, feeding on heather as their main food source, followed by crowberry, but actively selecting cowberry and cloudberry where it became available. Finally, mountain burnet caterpillars display a preference for habitats with large amounts of moss, rather than the moss itself, which we didn't see any evidence that it ate. This is likely to indicate that they're most abundant in moist areas, so their moisture can be maintained while eating and basking. As a secondary reason, it may also provide more camouflage from predators. On the moisture front, the impact of climate change on the cairngorms isn't known for sure, but it's predicted that the winters will become wetter and the summers drier. Certainly the weather that I got would suggest that this is becoming true. It is possible that this will negatively impact the population of this moth, as the drier areas such as Carn Leith, which already have quite low numbers may become uninhabitable, and the wetter areas like Curator, which is a bog, dry out and become unable to support the highly abundant numbers they currently enjoy.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm giving an update on my favourite micro moth, the Alpine coffee moth today. So we're continuing the mountain theme. So back in the spring, for those of you that were here, I sort of talked about what we were planning on doing this year, and today I'm going to give you an update on what we've actually done so far, and I hope you appreciate some of the quirky graphics that I've got for you today. So just as a quick recap and a couple of slides, particularly for those of you that weren't here in the spring presentation, this is one of our rarest micro moth species. It's found in Glen Clover, Glendale and Glen Callata at these sort of beautiful montane willow sites that you can see in front of us here. So these, as far as I'm concerned, are some of our most sort of stunning habitats in the UK. But to find the last few years when we were going out looking for this species, it's very hard to find the habitat, and the moth was in very low numbers. So we were really concerned about its status. And what we were wanting to kickstart this year was getting some good survey data collected to better understand how it's doing and what sort of conservation measures we should be putting in place. So this shows you the life cycle of the moth. The adult gets its name, Callisto coffeella, from the coffee-coloured wings, and we played on that pun quite a bit. We then have the caterpillar stages, so it makes a sort of blister, which looks a bit like a McCoy's crisp, and then also folds over a leaf. It then pupates inside a cocoon in between two sort of willow forks. We're particularly interested in that caterpillar and pupal stage from a survey perspective because they're the easiest way to record the species. Actually going out and finding the adults, which are absolutely tiny, is really difficult. And this is actually what we targeted to do this year. So we began by running 3 workshops. The first of these was online and is now hosted on our website. So the key thing with this workshop was to target folks that might be interested, going up in the hills, particularly montane willow experts who are up there sort of looking at these sorts of things on a regular basis. Could be that they could actually go and find that at some of their sites, but also to raise the profile of the species as well. Some of these obscure micro-moths, it's quite hard to get people sort of interested and galvanized about them. The only way you can do that is actually getting people out in the fields so that they can see it. So you can see the picture here. We're really lucky to have a few folks join us both from the April field workshop and also in the July field workshop. The other part of this is that we've worked quite a lot on Corrie National Nature Reserve, and we went out with Nature Scott staff on a separate visit as well, trained them up into what to look for, and that was really important when it came to some of our survey results. So when it came to our surveys, the moth is mapped from 10 1 kilometre squares across those 3 glens. And our priority over 2025 and 2026 is to get to all of those locations and really survey them in detail. Where are we finding the moth, where are we finding the habitat, and so on. So it's still a work in progress, but I'm really glad to stand here today and say that we've relocated the moth in 3 1 kilometre squares so far. So in terms of distribution, it seems to be relatively stable, but, and it does come with a big but, what we're finding is that outside the area that is deer fenced reserve, the habitat extent is extremely limited. So to give you an example, in a particular square, we found 3 separate populations of the moth. In each of those 3 areas, there was only 1 metre squared of habitat. So obviously we really need to be doing something about this if we want to sort of change the situation for the species. What has been really heartening from this year though is that we've had an increase in the number of records because people are getting interested in the species. So you can see so far we've had 25 new records. These are all at the sort of 10-figure grid reference level as well. So we're building up this sort of very detailed picture with regards to the species. Whereas before, most of the records, rightly so, were coming in sort of before GPS and so on. So we were getting them at the sort of 1K level. What was really heartening this year, though, is that we had a new record come in from Glendale. So Mike Smedley from Nature Scott actually went out and found them off in a new 1 kilometre square as well. So that was a population that we didn't previously know about. So that will be continuing to next year, and our key sort of aim is to get around to each of those sites. We have also had folks out looking in random locations outside those known regions. So there was a survey undertaken at Ben Wills by Dan Watson. Unfortunately, no signs of the moth so far, but if any of you know Ben Wills, there's plenty more willows to be searching on. So as part of these surveys, we've also found out quite a lot of ecological information about the moth, which is important when we come to the point of trying to do sort of restoration, bringing willows back onto the hill and so on. So what we've recorded so far is that the moths are carrying at an altitude of between about 580 and 720 meters, but the majority of these records are coming from sort of 650 meters plus. So they tend to be sort of in that narrower band higher up the hill. We also learned information about the tree location. So we're finding the moth particularly along burns, along waterfalls, also sort of on crags and so on. But if you look in the middle picture here, what you'll see is a willow growing a sort of sprawling growth pattern over rocky slabs. And we found that was actually really productive habitat for finding this species. The best thing we found this year, though, is that we found a few willows that were growing out in the open. So on the Corrie Nature Reserve, that actually reduced deer numbers in the last couple of years. And there was a couple of willows, maybe about that tall, that were beginning to regenerate, and we found them off on those as well. So that's really what we want to aim at in the long term, is that the moth doesn't have to just be restricted to some of this refugia sites, which is where we're finding it currently. The next thing we found is that shelter is also unsurprisingly important for a mountain species that's exposed to high winds, lots of snow and sort of ice cover in the winter. They'll obviously preferentially select these more sheltered locations, like we can see in the top picture here. So in amongst these sorts of gullies and so on is particularly good. But as always with ecology, not the moths read the manual, you start to read them, I start to think, oh, they're really holding on shelter. I then got to this tree on this skyline here, which is the most exposed willow I've come across so far, and lo and behold, the moth was found on there. So they've obviously got a bit of flexibility to them. And it also just shows you need to keep an open mind as an ecologist, even when you begin to think you're understanding something. The next sort of things we were interested in was the sort of size of the trees that the moth was found on. So what we were finding is actually they were homing on these slightly smaller trees rather than the larger bushes you might see up on the hill. So to give you an indication, in the top of this picture here, those trees were about this sort of tall. But we did find them on some other sort of smaller bushes growing out of crags. I think the reason for why we didn't find them on the sort of larger trees is potentially competition with sawflies, and I'll come on to that a bit more on the next slide. If you look at the bottom picture here, you can see a large willow growing out of the crag there. So we never found the moth on those, but on two tiny trees either side of that is actually we're finding it quite readily. So there's some sort of selection going on there between size of the tree. Now, I said it quite clear cut in terms of the species of willow. It was probably dark-leaved willow and maybe tea-leaved willow. I'm probably at this point more confused about what species there are than we were at the start of the year. So we're actually very lucky that we had a botanical expert come up with us in the sort of July workshop. And what we think is going on is that they're selecting the sort of dark-leaved willow, but these are often sort of hybrids with other species of willow as well. So particularly things like tea-leaved willow. So a lot more work needs to be done on that. The most interesting thing we found, though, is that we usually think the moth focuses in on smooth-leaved sort of willows, And we actually found cocoons on what looked like a hybrid between dark-leaved willow and goat willow, which is quite an interesting thing. And there are a few records of that sort of hybrid occurring on the reserve. The final interesting thing that we found from the surveys so far this year is in terms of sort of connectivity. So we actually found the moth more commonly on, as I said before, the sort of smaller, but also the slightly more isolated bushes. So where we get the bushes growing in sort of 1s and 2s, we would find moth. But if we found sort of clusters of, say, 15, 20 willows, we very rarely found the moth in those sorts of situations. And I think what's going on there is a potential sort of competition with sawfly species. So these can be particularly common in montane areas. And we get these clusters of larger trees and also sort of more trees together. What we're seeing is really high abundance of sawflies. And when you get close to some of these willows, they have a real sort of smell to them when they release the chemical from being sort of eaten by these species. And I suspect what the moth is doing is selecting in and homing in on these trees that haven't been eaten as much by sawflies. Obviously, that's just a sort of ecological hunch. What we did also find is that when we are sort of recording the Alpine coffee moth on these trees, we get very few sawflies occurring in those trees as well. So there seems to be some sort of competition going on there. So obviously, none of this would be possible without funding. We've been really lucky that the surveys have been supported by Nature Scott. But as I mentioned earlier in the spring, we've given this moth a nickname of the Alpine coffee moth. And what's been really great is that it gives you sort of opportunities to find novel funding sources. So we were approached by Vicky Ruddle, who runs a small coffee roasting company called Monarch Beans. And she was interested in partnering with butterfly conservation and asked if we had anything that might be suitable. Well, as you can imagine, I suggested the Alpine coffee moth to begin with. And we now have probably raised the world's first coffee that sponsors the coffee moth. So if you're interested, you can go online and buy this. And some of the proceeds go towards our work as well, and some of the conservation work that we're planning for this species. So something a bit novel. There we go, we've got one recommendation from Graham. So in terms of next steps, we want to continue this survey going into 2026. So this sort of autumn and next spring, we'll be getting into places like Glencallata. So it's a real priority to re-find the moth there. We want to finish off surveying a lot of these sites in Glendale and also Glenclover. It's obviously slow progress. You can see the sort of terrain. You're not going to get around to these sites very quickly and tick them off. Often takes 1 or 2 attempts to actually go in, locate the habitat and find the species. We've then also been looking for funding to trial different methods for establishing willows as well. So in the long term, we want to look to increase the amount of willows at some of these sites, improve the connectivity. So I mentioned that area that's only got sort of 3 meters squared of habitat. And we want to sort of see if there's ways that we can do this around some of the sort of high herbivore browsing pressures that we currently have. And other ways of bringing in funding, well, who knows? One person who's actually in the room, Sally, brought a coffee cake to one of the workshops. So why not have a coffee moth coffee cake in the future? M&S make their caterpillar cakes, so maybe we could convince them to do something like that. So I hope you enjoyed that. That's just a sort of quick update on what we've been up to this year. I'm going to leave you with a few pictures of some of these wonderful sites and one of the happiest helpers that we had on surveys as well. So I hope you enjoyed the day. And if you want to have a chat about anything Alpine coffee moth and what we've been up to, please just grab me after this.